Naturally, there's a dividing line in Nottingham Forest's history set before and after the arrival of Brian Clough in 1975. We all know what he did at the City Ground, champions of England, twice champions of Europe. What few do know is what Nottingham Forest were like before 1975. This is that story. Here's your book recommendation for this week. It's Don Wright's Forever Forest, the absolute best and most comprehensive history on the club. It was the 1860s where football came to Lacetown and became the most popular pastime in the industrial city. By the middle part of the decade, we had two formal football teams that still stick about the place today. Notts County forming in 1864, Nottingham Forest following the year after. Of course, we're here to talk about the latter. Very much of their time, Forest choose the Garibaldi red thanks to the Italian unification legend Giuseppe Garibaldi, and they were almost immediately at the races. In their first two entries into the world's oldest football competition, the FA Cup, Forest ventured out into the semi-finals, first going down to Old Etonians 2-1 in March 1879 before following that one up 12 months later against Oxford University. 5 years later they replicated the feat, this time getting a draw against Queen's Park. Unfortunately, it would not be third time lucky as they fell 3-0 in the replay. By the 1890s though, there were other means to material success as the Football League was formed. In 1892, Forest could count themselves as one of the 28 teams when they won the Football Alliance. 3 teams would be fast-tracked into the First Division. The Wednesday earned the most votes with 10 and Nottingham Forest got 9, both ahead of league teams Accrington and Stoke, as well as the eventually elected Newton Heath, who of course would go on to become Manchester United. Forest then spent the next 6 years bobbing about the top flight of English football, safe from the perils of relegation and re-election, without making much of a dent in the FA Cup since their 1892 semi-final loss in a second replay against West Bromwich Albion. The 1897-98 campaign would change all of that. Grimsby Town and Grimsby Trinity both dismantled in the earlier rounds before revenge had been sworn against West Brom in the quarter-finals. It had proved fifth time lucky for Forest in the semis, drawing the first game at Bramall Lane with Southampton 1-1 before dispatching of the Saints down at the final venue Crystal Palace 2-0 in a blizzard. With Southampton's demands of a replay thrown out by the FA, Forest returned 3 weeks later dispatching Steve Bloomer and his Derby County team. Arthur Cape's the man with a cup-winning brace. It would be well over half a century by the time Forest returned. In the meantime, they took advantage of their newfound glory by moving into what was their umpteenth home in 30-odd years when the City Ground was moved into that summer. They obviously remain there to this day. At the turn of the century, Forest had secured themselves at both ends of the pitch. Grenville Morris and Jack Calvey would score the lion's share of the goals, whilst Harry Lineker kept goal. Entering the spring of 1901, it appeared as though Forest would have to make room in the trophy cabinet as they returned home from Bury victorious to end March, well positioned joint top of English football alongside Sunderland. They would win just one of their remaining 5 games, ultimately sinking to 4th position, even below a little-known team called Notts County. It ought to have been an empire that Forest were building after their cup success in 1898. After all, they returned to the semis in 1900, only to lose 3-2 to Bury before replicating that the year after their title capitulation, this time losing to Southampton, who were more than happy to twist the knife in. It wasn't for footballing reasons that Nottingham Forest descended from what could have been their perch atop English football, but for a blazing fire that completely destroyed the main pavilion at the City Ground in July 1904. From regular finishers within the top 5, Nottingham Forest would eventually find themselves relegated in 1906 after a 4-1 defeat at Goodison Park. The club was doing just about anything to scrape together the cash to survive, hosting an FA Cup semi-final between Everton and Villa in 1905 before weeks later touring South America, a move which indirectly bestowed Independiente with the red and white they still wear today. Don't worry about Forest however, Grenville Morris was still sticking in the goals and they would return the club immediately back to the First Division at an absolute canter, 12 points ahead of Leicester Fosse. They'd return with the top goal scorer in the First Division Division 2 as Enoch West rattled in 26 goals to top the scoring charts in the 1907-08 season before he added another 25 the campaign after in what were ultimately mid-table seasons. It was not long before they were back in the second tier after a disastrous run of form to end the season, 1 point from their final 13 matches, which plucked them from 9th to rock bottom. Before the war halted football in 1915, Forest showed virtually no signs of returning in a hurry, placing between 15th and 20th. The resumption of football saw no change in Forest fortunes, again in the bottom 6 with a 4th consecutive first round elimination from the Cup secured in the 1920-21 season. Later that year, however, Sam Hardy was signed by the club for £1,000. The 38-year-old goalkeeper would have an enormous say on their promotion back to the top flight in 1922. The club conceded just 30 goals, even in a time of suspicion around a lack of goals. Forest's record was just 1 goal shy of a Football League record for a 42-game season held by Bristol City from the prior campaign. There was peace in Europe, there was momentum on the Trent. Now was the time for Nottingham Forest's resurgence. You'd have thought so anyway. After 2 seasons of struggling against the tide of relegation, West Brom finally put them out of their misery 3 games from the end of the 1924-25 campaign. In their absence from the top flight of English football, Forest completely retooled their half-back line. Billy McKinlay and Tommy Graham would both make their debuts in 1927 and go on to make well over 600 combined league appearances for Forest. Meanwhile, Bob Pugh completed the set when he signed in 1931. Up top there was Johnny Dent, signing in 1929 for what was still quite a sizable £1.5 grand. It'd prove a bargain after he bagged himself 122 goals in 207 games, top scoring for the club in 3 separate seasons. And still there was absolutely nothing to shout about outside of 3 FA Cup quarter-finals before war returned to the continent. First it was eventual winners Bolton in 1926, 2 years later it was 1925 winners Sheffield United, and then in 1930 it was perennial league champions Sheffield Wednesday. All the while, Forest languished in the bottom half of the second division. Across the river, Notts County were in even worse shape. By 1932, they were residing in the 3rd Division South, and with football faltering on the Trent, talks of a merger between the two was whispered about. It never did come to fruition. By the end of the 30s, Forest looked serious contenders to be joining their neighbours in the 3rd tier of English football. After 2 bottom 4 finishes and relegation a real possibility, David Martin, the heir apparent to Johnny Dent's goals, came up massive on May 7th, 1938. With a point needed to stay in the division against the team directly beneath them, Martin netted twice against Barnsley. His second 5 minutes from time, the difference as Forest stayed up by 2/1000ths of a goal. Whoa! What is it good for is what Bruce Springsteen sang, and for Nottingham Forest, well, it would at least put a pause on a clear trajectory towards the 3rd tier after another 20th place in 1939. During the conflict, Forest had been dredged out of the red by a committee member called Mr. H.R. Cobbin, who wrote the club an enormous cheque to stave off their debts. It didn't harm the club either way that Sailor Brown had passed through the club for a season, netted 17 goals and was able to spin the club a tidy profit before moving on to Villa. But when league football resumed in 1946, Forest would only temporarily return to mid-table, quickly swapping that for more relegation scraps in the late 40s. By 1949, Nottingham Forest had entered the 3rd tier of English football for the first time in their history. Their final day win at home to Bury was not enough, as Leicester snuck a late result in Cardiff to relegate their local rivals. Thankfully, when Forest were plunged into the chaos of the 3rd tier, Billy Walker was the man at the helm, ready to steer them back. From spending record amounts of money, Forest were now having to rely on handouts from supporters so they could buy a new kit. Ultimately, they would have to sell off prized assets in George Lee and Jack Edwards to stay afloat. By 1951, he had done so. In Willie Ardron, they had found themselves a prolific goalscorer as the club found the net a mammoth 110 times. In addition to Forest reserves teams smashing its way through the Midland League, scoring 103 times, 9 points ahead of second place Rotherham United. The front line consisted of Wally Ardron, Tom Johnson, Freddie Scott, Tommy Capel and Colin Collindridge remained insatiable in the second tier, where they maintained a place within the top 7 in the first 3 campaigns back. With such a powerful squad, Billy Walker was reluctant to add too much to it. As such, Alan Orr and Noel Kelly were the only acquisitions that summer. Then you had Billy McKinley's nephew Bob breaking into the squad, and there was more than enough for Forest to be competitive. Entering December, Forest were well stationed in 5th after roughly half of the campaign, ready to pounce on any slip-ups. Then Colin Collindridge went and broke his leg and was out until Easter. Still, Forest continued in their charge to the top of the division, leading the table after a March 15th victory over Coventry City. Sadly though, they'd win just 2 of their remaining 8 fixtures to wind up in a still creditable 4th place.
In comes the centre, the goalie misses, and Moore races in to slam it in.
But for the ability to grab that footage as Notts County finished a lowly 19th, there wouldn't be a whole lot of positives to be gleaned from the 52-53 campaign as Forest regressed to 7th in search of a promotion back to the big time. It was clearly the end of an era. Wally Ardron wasn't getting any younger, he played just 50 matches as Alan Moore deputised for him magnificently, grabbing 29 goals. Also, there was a small matter of the club losing both Tommy Capel and Colin Collindridge to Coventry City. Earmarked to replace Ardron, Ronnie Blackman was signed from Reading for $8 grand in the summer of '54. He'd carved out a reputation for being goal hungry. 39 strikes in a single season for the Berkshire club would do that, but he would wound up playing even less than Ardron, playing 2 fewer league games before being shipped off to Ipswich Town in the 3rd tier. As a result, the league season was a disaster, descending from 4th place all the way down to 15th, finishing so far beneath Notts County that we can't fit them in on the screen here. There was a shred of positivity to take from the FA Cup as both Sheffield United and Hartlepool United were dispatched. In the 5th round, however, they were eliminated by Newcastle United, the team of their era, but it did take 3 games for Forest to be beaten. The belated improvement of the front line came in Jim Barrett, $7.5 grand from West Ham, acquired midway through that season. He'd top score for the club in the next 3 campaigns. All in all, it meant 10 more goals added to their league tally and a climb back up to 7th, only 5 points off the promotion pace of Leeds United. As Barrett continued to bang in the goals, a real replacement for Ardron made himself known, and he had been there all along. Tommy Wilson was switched from the wing to centre forward, helping himself to 14 goals. The next season, Forest got off to an impeccable start, unbeaten in their first 7, and not only that, they were obliterating teams, 4-1 against Orient and Swansea, 5-1 against Bristol City. A few defeats in the latter weeks of 1956 or the returning distraction of the Cup would not hinder Forest. Yeah, in between Cup progressions against Portsmouth and Barnsley, Forest made time to twat both Port Vale and Barnsley 7-1 in successive games. And with that latest win in the Cup, it meant the television cameras came to town.
Forest. Then a long-range Forest shot goes over the top. Leading goal scorer for Birmingham, Govan gets across the flank centre, but it brings no reward.
Sadly, that footage isn't the pivotal replay at the City Ground. Then again, Birmingham did sneak a 1-0 win, leaving Forest without the Cup for the 49th consecutive season. But there would be silverware waiting for them, as their unbeaten start to league football in 1957 would be enough for Forest to get over the line and into the top flight. They were back in the big time, they'd finally mended their ailing front line, and now they were stocked and ready to go on numerous fronts. Nottingham Forest were back. Tommy Wilson was banging in the goals, and it was quickly apparent that they weren't here to make up the numbers. In fact, Forest lost just 1 of their first 8, even going so far as to slap Burnley about a bit 7-0 at the City Ground before sinking recent champions Portsmouth at Fratton Park 4-1. Unfortunately, losses would soon return to the club as the Knights drew in what would become a rare win at home to Sunderland on December the 7th. The season looked to have spun on a dime thanks to Jim Barrett's torn knee ligaments. Forest, though, hung on in there, struggling to enough results to make up a safe mid-table finish, a good return under the circumstances. Nottingham Forest are the answer to the quiz question, who were Manchester United's first opponents after the Munich air disaster, as only Harry Gregg and Bill Foulkes lined up for United at Old Trafford from their previous league match 3 weeks prior. The truce of a 1-1 draw seemed fair. That summer, Billy Walker went big in the transfer market and returned with almost £30,000 worth of new signings. In from Sunderland came Joe McDonnell, whilst Grimsby Town's Jeff Whitefoot was added, and Elton John's uncle, Roy Dwight, was the costliest yet at 14 grand. It had been a middling season that Forest appeared only to be growing into by the turn of the year, as they sat 8th and only 5 points off the pace set by the perennial favourites Wolves, who were governed by Stan Cullis. Then the Cup showed up, and everything changed.
Clearance went straight to Granger. He ran it into the net. Tooting were 1 up. Amateurs played like men inspired.
Ted Murphy volleyed a terrific shot to score from 35 yards out. Tootingham Mitcham 2, Notts Forest 0.
Yes, that really is Tootingham Mitcham, who had never reached this stage before but had eliminated 2 league opponents, and they went 2 up here, but Forest pegged them back and took them back to the City Ground 2 weeks later, eliminating them. Grimsby Town were far more comprehensively eliminated 4 days later in the 4th round, and whilst it took 3 games to beat Birmingham, it had been another comeback saving Forest late on in the first game, viewed by 55,000 at St Andrews. The tie was finally sealed in the 3rd game at Filbert Street, emphatically too, 5-0. Weeks later, Birmingham would have a modicum of revenge, beating Forest 7-1 in the league. Next were the holders of the Cup, Bolton Wanderers, and once again, as he often did, Tommy Wilson was crucial in finding the winning goal to dump out the favourites, and so to Hillsborough to meet Aston Villa.
Wilson put the ball across to Quigley. He brought it under control, shot, and it was in the net.
Villa were the club that Billy Walker had won the Cup with 39 years previously as a player, and with Wednesday, the club he won it with as a manager. Now he had the chance to get it for the 3rd time, waiting for them in their first ever visit to Wembley, a Luton Town team that they could be called favourites over.
Wilson's in the middle. We're taking back. Gray.
Nottingham Forest hadn't won a trophy in 61 years, but it was well worth the wait. The same 11 that had played the entire way through the competition, but would never play together again. Roy Dwight's injury took him out of action for a year, and would result in him playing just twice more for the club. The subsequent 59-60 season was an understandable hangover, as Forest just about managed to survive the drop ahead of Leeds United by a point, as their Wembley nemesis Luton Town went down bottom of the pile. That summer, Billy Walker moved upstairs with health failing, with arguably his star player Tommy Wilson, top scorer in the past 3 years, joining him in departing that September. Next into the dugout was the former Huddersfield and Carlisle manager Andy Beattie, after Harry Catterick wasn't able to be persuaded out of Hillsborough. Beattie was only able to conjure up 2 wins before mid-November, as the club were forced to rally in the second half of the campaign just to stay safe in 14th. With it, a bizarre qualification into the Fairs Cup as the highest ranked team from Nottingham, which was safe to say in every year really. This jaunt into Europe though was stopped at the very first hurdle against Valencia, comprehensively 7-1 on aggregate, in an otherwise nondescript season that saw Forest just 4 points above the dotted line back home. In the following 62-63 campaign, however, Forest improved in the league, finishing well within the top half, and could even boast an appearance in the quarter-final of the Cup, eliminating Wolves, West Brom and Leeds before ultimately being found out after 3 games against Southampton. That summer it was the turn of former Manchester United player Johnny Carey to attempt to steer the club in the right direction. By now it wasn't a club short on goals, as Frank Wignall was signed to add to Colin Addison, as well as the emergence of a certain Ian Storey-Moore. The result, another cosy season in mid-table. And despite the footage I've just shown you, the 64-65 campaign was record-breaking. Forest acquired a record points tally of 47, even if they didn't register a best-ever finish, only landing in 5th place behind the likes of Everton, Chelsea, Leeds and the eventual champions, Man United. The 65-66 season started well before it started, with a centenary tour of North America taken in New York, St. Louis, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, Vancouver and Toronto. Successful on and off the pitch, the real season began well too. Forest 4-2 victors at home to Manchester United. Such were the inconsistencies of Forest, they'd soon slum it in the lower reaches of the table, flitting wildly from the great afternoons as aforementioned to the crippling lows of getting pumped 5-0 at places like Ewood Park in November. The club were more than willing to seize their moment, however, as Joe Baker signed for a club record £65,000 from Arsenal in the March of '66.
And Wallace playing now. Moore, he scored a great goal by Moore.
A brilliant shot by Jimmy Green.
The 66-67 campaign would go down as the almost double season. In the league, results like home triumphs against Man United in October, Arsenal in November and Everton on Boxing Day had them only 3 points off the pace at the turn of the year. When the Cup returned, Forest were comfortable in dispatching of Plymouth and Newcastle, while Swindon took 3 games and Everton were squeaked by. Unfortunately, it was Jimmy Greaves who proved the end of the line for Forest's third Cup ambitions as they were ejected out of the semi-final by Spurs. But as they picked up the pieces, Forest had 3 league games left and a 5-point deficit to make up on leaders Manchester United with a game in hand. An already insurmountable looking task was ended by Southampton, defeating them at the Dell. It meant a return to Europe by actually qualifying on merit this time, and this time they went beyond the first round, thrashing former European Cup finalists Eintracht Frankfurt before ultimately being eliminated in the second round. It was a campaign interrupted after Peter Grummett broke his arm in an FA Cup loss at Leeds. He'd missed the remainder of the season in goal, returning for the second game of the subsequent season against Chelsea, only to break his thumb immediately. And it got worse for Forest as their hosting of Leeds on August 24th had to be abandoned because the main stand was engulfed in flames. Naturally, form slumped, and by the end of the year, Johnny Carey was gone. The £100,000 signing of Jim Baxter, a legend up north but past his peak down in England, distracted the club further as they finished 18th. Matt Gillies was hired, a man who had masterminded Leicester's charges to Wembley and silverware. A combination of the new man in the dugout and the goals from Ian Storey-Moore helped confirm survival in the top flight in 1969. As the 60s became the 70s, Forest settled for beige mid-table seasons with nothing to shout about, as their one flickering light remained Ian Storey-Moore, whose goals continued to flow. But midway through the 71-72 season, there was a very public tug-of-war over the forward. A certain Brian Clough had him paraded around the baseball ground, only for him to move to Manchester United after a £200,000 bid from them was also accepted. Despite losing their talisman halfway through the season, he still top scored for Forest as they miserably went down. In the latter weeks of 72, however, former Derby captain Dave Mackay replaced the outgoing Gillies, representing somewhat of a coup as he was unable to drag them out of mid-table in the second division. Ultimately, before he got a chance to show his managerial prowess, he was off. In October 73, a chance presented itself for Mackay to return to the baseball ground and succeed championship-winning manager Brian Clough, so he took it, going on to win the league title in under 2 years for Derby.
Now Johnson. Renfield, a gift! An absolute gift!
Despite that thrashing, the 73-74 campaign was all about the cup as mid-tableness continued. Without Storey-Moore now, the onus was on Duncan McKenzie to dazzle the City ground. And after sticking fours beyond both Bristol Rovers and Manchester City, Portsmouth were beaten to take the club into a bizarre 3-game spectacle against Newcastle United in the quarter-final.
And 2 similar goals from Super Mac against Burnley in the semi-final meant that Newcastle were back at Wembley after 19 years.
Long story short, Forest led at St James's Park 3-1 in the first game, only for a pitch invasion to threaten an abandonment in the north-east. When the players returned, Newcastle staged an incredible comeback to seemingly win 4-3. Only the FA demanded the game be replayed in full, with the second outing drawn at Goodison Park and the eventual footage you've just seen finally putting an end to the whole ordeal. Newcastle would go on to get shagged 3-0 in the Wembley final in Bill Shankly's last big outing as Liverpool boss. Of course, Duncan McKenzie's 28 goals wasn't going to go unnoticed, and he was quickly signed by Don Revie and Leeds United. In the meantime, Forest continued their squelch in the second tier, descending to 16th, their worst position since their 1951 promotion from the 3rd Division.
Forward by Cottam, Bowyer's header, and Neil Martin coming in, Bowyer! Curling in, Cottam there, and he's got it in!
Nottingham Forest had got bad at football again at the most imperfect time with the advent of the Premier League and the end of Brian Clough's career. It was to be his former captain, however, Frank Clark, who led top-flight football back to the City Ground. This is a story of Nottingham Forest's Premier League years in the 1990s.
Could you excuse me, and thank you for asking me to be interviewed, and I'll go back to Barbara and my grandchildren.
It's been a pleasure knowing you, sir. Enjoy your retirement.
Thank you.
How do you replace someone like Brian Clough? He was not only a club legend, but if anybody could be bigger than a club, perhaps this was that instance. Relegation from the Premier League meant lots of sales, but also lots of money for the next manager, as Roy Keane's relegation clause was triggered by Man United and the duo of Nigel Clough and Gary Charles departed. It meant £7 million to play with. The man in charge of that money would be Frank Clark, a player signed by Clough in 1975, who bowed out of his playing career in the best circumstances by winning the European Cup. Since then, he had begun his managerial career with 8 years in the Leyton Orient hot seat, where he'd yo-yoed the club between the 4th and 3rd tiers. After 8 years as Orient's manager, he had been the managing director at Brisbane Road for a further 2 years. Now he was back in the thick of it at the City Ground. It was a busy-ass summer in the transfer market. Stan Collimore's £2 million signing from Southend United, the most expensive of the lot, whilst Colin Cooper shored up the backline from Middlesbrough and both Des Little and David Phillips were added. Another small victory was achieved in Stuart Pearce's contract renewal, while Steve Stone was made into an ever-present after skirting around the fringes of the first team for the past 2 years.
Characteristic long ball from Neil Webb. Rosario chasing Futcher back to his keeper. And Crichton's missed it. Well, that will go down as an own goal and Muddy Black. All of a sudden the defence goes away and Black has indeed scored. Kingsley Black, he in turn sets up Collymore. That's where he likes them. And that's why. Cross is a deep one. Hooked back in, a chance for Kingsley Black on his right foot, not his favourite one.
Yeah. What a superb finish.
They had eased into the division somewhat with a pair of draws before sticking 5 beyond Grimsby. Whilst the Anglo-Italian Cup needn't have meant anything, losing to Derby and Notts County might have rankled with some. However, there was progress to be made in the League Cup. Wrexham dispatched over 2 legs, with top-flight outfits in West Ham United and Manchester City falling by the wayside before Christmas. And after correcting some of their earlier inconsistencies, Forest were right back in the thick of promotion discussion, sitting 8th, only 6 points off the automatics with games in hand. Stan Collymore had been a revelation, at least when he was on the pitch. Still, despite the tonsillitis that plagued the start of his season and then the persistent injuries throughout, he was able to find the back of the net 19 times. It also helped that Lars Bohinen was added from Young Boys for $450,000 in November, further bolstering what was still a Premier League quality side.
Going for glory, Thomas alongside him. Aldrich at the far post, Aldrich gets it back in, a chance for Thomas, and Tranmere Rovers! One for Poole there, and his kick straight to Kimmel, who plays it straight back in.
Stone. Giving plenty of room to come forward. Stone picks the ball up yet again. Well, that's as calm a finish as you'll see all day. And there's confusion, and, well, no confusion as far as Colin Cooper's concerned. If Forest could get one more now, promotion is assured. What better than a Collymore goal, his 24th of the season.
Whilst Frank Clark wouldn't be able to replicate the winning of the League Cup at the City Ground as his former manager had done, it was a successful first season nonetheless. The tranche of January Cup games arrived when Forest suffered a low ebb to their season, but after all their quick-fire eliminations in the FA Cup to Sheffield Wednesday and in the League Cup to Tranmere Rovers, it only helped focus the minds at the City Ground. Once the cobwebs were shaken and February was discarded, Forest would lose just one more game away at Portsmouth in March before confirming promotion with a 3-2 victory at Peterborough 5 weeks later. The sheer quality at the City Ground was obvious, and that's why Clark chose to add just one summer signing in advance of their Premier League return, Brian Roy, for a club record £2.9 million from Italian outfit Foggia.
Bounce. Stone got a deflection, and
He's already scored 5 times this season, and now he's set up Steve Stone. It's a goal for Forest.
Trying to create an angle to Kurtz! And that's a splendid goal!
And trust me, this ain't cherry-picking all the good results. Nottingham Forest really were undefeated in all competitions until October 29th, and even that can be excused as the eventual champions visited the City Ground and grabbed the win. Right from the off, Brian Roy slotted straight in, scoring on his debut at Portman Road on the opening day of the season, with Stan Collymore continuing to bag goals at a rate of knots. Dovetailing with a new signing, it suddenly felt a bit 1978 in Nottingham all over again. From the League Cup victories over Hereford United and Wolves to qualify for the last 16 to the numerous league victories already chalked up over teams like Everton, Sheffield Wednesday, Spurs, QPR and Villa, there was talk of Europe once again.
Around the penalty spot for the free kick. Dave Mitchell just behind him. Oh, it's gone straight in. What a remarkable goal.
The run at the Arsenal defence, a left foot shot here, and it's a stunning strike by the Dutchman. Forest ahead again. Up he comes, left foot, bang, it's a goal, and Nottingham Forest.
He's done it! Stan Collymore!
Alright, that had been dented with the League Cup exit to Millwall, which didn't really tell the story of the season thus far, yet it did come in a bit of a November slump, admittedly, when teams like Liverpool, Newcastle, Chelsea, Leeds and Blackburn were turning up week in, week out in a bit of a howler there from the fixture computer. It did not relent. Arsenal and Manchester United were to come in December, and unbelievably, 4 points were taken from the fixtures. So when the Christmas crackers were being popped and your man was burning that turkey over there, Forest was sat behind only the triumvirate of teams of their era: Blackburn, Man United and Newcastle.
And Forest got off to a bad start today when they didn't deal with a John Solarco cross. Chris Armstrong.
Pierce arriving in support, and Ian Wone. Collymore in the middle, and Collymore scores!
He's taking a fair old run at it. Three-man wall. Pierce. Oh yes, top cut.
Coming to the end of a magnificent campaign on their return to England's Premier League, and last weekend's win over Manchester City ensured they will play in Europe next season.
It looked as though that run was going to be unsustainable, especially with the pretty mediocre start to 1995, what with its cup exit at home to Crystal Palace and the 6 points taken from the first 7 matches of the year in league competition. But little did anybody know their 1-0 loss at Highbury would be Forest's last of the season. Their remaining fixtures would read something like out of the page of the late 70s, from going to Leicester and scoring 4 times to sticking 7 beyond Sheffield Wednesday at Hillsborough. Forest ended the season with 33 points from an available 39. Not only did it record 77 points, securing 3rd place, but it meant a shot at Europe via the UEFA Cup, as teams like Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle and Spurs were all held off from the top 3. Collymore netted 25 in all competitions, supplemented perfectly by Brian Roy's 14. Stuart Pearce even got double figures. Meanwhile, the man who wound up with the club's Player of the Year was Steve Stone. And yet, 3rd place in the league for a new Premier League club there was always going to be a high turnover of players. This fast-tracked by Stan Collymore leaving for Liverpool for a British record £8.5 million. Attempting to fill that void, Kevin Campbell was picked up from Arsenal and Chris Bart-Williams was acquired from Sheffield Wednesday, before a sprinkling of what was supposed to be continental delight in Andrea Silenzi from Torino. Supposedly a former teammate of Diego Maradona and Gianfranco Zola, he lasted just 7 games for Forest. Forest had even managed to skirt away from defeat in the Premier League until November the 18th, but were handed their first loss once again by Blackburn Rovers at Ewood Park, this time settling for just the 7 goals in mid-November. Forest had been solid, with a rare propensity for a thriller, from a 4-3 triumph down at the Dell on the opening weekend to coming off the back of a UEFA Cup trip to sneak a win over Bolton by 3-2, as well as knocking back Wimbledon by 4. Yes, Europe was navigated in the earlier months of the 95-96 season to virtually zero detriment.
Roy. To out in for Holland. Stone has made that run through the middle. Here's Stone now, he's in the clear. Steve Stone! It's there! Oh, the keeper saves it, and there's McGregor. There's a goal!
From the European Cup final reunion with Malmo to the new age footballer Guy Roos, Auxerre and in the third round their compatriots Lyon, Forest hardly blitzed through the field, but their strong and penetrative football was effective on the continent. And whilst they had fallen at the first hurdle of the League Cup to little old Bradford City, the same couldn't be said of the FA Cup. As Stoke and Oxford were picked apart after 2 games, it took 3 to beat Spurs after the first got abandoned and the second was drawn before finally Villa eliminated Forest from the quarter-finals. It was understandable, however, since Forest were midway through 2 intense legs of European football against grandiose opposition of Bayern Munich. Plus, they were flying the flag for their entire country. After Man United, Liverpool and Leeds had all been put out of the UEFA Cup by October, Everton barrelled out of the Cup Winners' Cup in November, and Blackburn were, of course, a non-starter in the Champions League groups.
High control. Storms a good ball, and the header was deadly. And he got the perfect ball in. What can Forest do? That's remarkable. Again, Sforza, Scholl, 2-1.
And that is Ziga, and that's a goal for Forest. This is Strunz, and that Strunz's shot deflected goal. Klinsmann comes in for the header, and it's off the line, and Klinsmann, it's in. Good pass here to Fry. Ball curled in. There's the header. Oh, it's another one. Again, Klinsmann's through, and the linesman's waved him on, and Klinsmann goes round the goalkeeper. Oh, he's got it back beautifully from Lee, and Steve Stone scores.
Bayern Munich were just too good and would ultimately go on to win the competition before graduating to competing for the Champions League by the end of the decade. It's safe to say that both clubs went in very different directions after this one. Meanwhile, in the Premier League, thanks to the hotting up of the schedules via the cup competitions, Forest's league form suffered as a result, as they finished a distinctly average 9th, which was decent enough going for a relatively new team to the division who had competed on 3 of 4 fronts. That summer, the club helped host Euro 96. They had a new 30,000-seater stadium in the City Ground, and they were going great in all competitions, at home and abroad. Just what could go wrong?
Michael Gray now, backing off him rather, tries the shot and scores!
It's in the centre of the field, it's a lovely ball through. Pearce has made a mistake, and he's punished for that!
Inspiration was Stan Collymore, who began another miserable night for his old club after just 6 minutes.
Forest had spent big in the summer again. Croatian Nikola Jurkan from Real Oviedo was £1 million, Dean Saunders even more. However, with Kevin Campbell's back problems, his minutes were limited. All of it piled up from the poor start to the season that encapsulated another early exit from the League Cup and defeats to teams like Sunderland, West Ham and Everton in front of their own fans. With the club rock bottom of the Premier League after a loss at Anfield, Frank Clark resigned as manager at the City Ground despite a manageable 3-point deficit to make up. Ultimately, it would be Stuart Pearce becoming player caretaker, even going so far as to win the January Manager of the Month award in a bout of new manager bounce. Despite his 5 wins from 6 and progression in the Cup against Ipswich and Newcastle, Forest would win just 1 more game in all competitions after that. They went out of the Cup to, drumroll please, Chesterfield, with their only triumph coming in the first day of March away at White Hart Lane. It never was going to be enough to guarantee survival, therefore with their position at the bottom, 7 points off 17th, Forest were down and had to start all over again. In more ways than one, since something called the Bridgeford Consortium bought into a club now £11 million in debt. Dave Passett was their first move, with the former Wimbledon manager tasked with performing similar miracles in Nottingham but as general manager. With relegation, he was moved down into the dugout as manager and instantly got to work, with Brian Roy being sold to Hertha Berlin and Celtic's Pierre van Hooijdonk replacing him for £4.5 million. Meanwhile, at fullback, Alan Rodgers replaced Stuart Pearce, who was away to Newcastle, and they were hoping to slingshot themselves back into the top flight at the first time of asking.
Here's Campbell. Thomas has made a great burst into the box, but it's Bonaire! Marshall save, Van Hooijdonk go for the follow-up, and he's got there! Friday night fixture. Cooper shot! Oh, and it's in off the post! Superb strike! Inviting. The Dutchman strikes. Yes, it's there!
And in spite of a 10-1 League Cup aggregate win over the mighty Doncaster Rovers, it took time for the new regime to gel with the players, with 3 defeats to begin September. However, it was clear that Van Hooijdonk and Campbell's partnership was blossoming brilliantly as 1997 ended. The club suffered just 2 more defeats at Bury and Wolves before Christmas Day. Therefore, entering the year known by many as 1998, Forest were alongside promotion favourites Middlesbrough, together in the automatics after 25 matches with 51 points each.
Ambles up and crashes it into the back of the net. It's in too many pressure and it's there. Van Hooijdonk again tries the shot, a blistering shot. Oh, what a goal!
Here comes the Dutchman. And this time he's got it!
Whilst Walsall and Charlton Athletic ended Forest's time of it in the domestic cups in an early fashion, all it did was give Forest a 21-game shootout with no further distractions to try and wrap up an immediate return to the Premier League. They began with concertina win and defeat in January before turning on the style. 3 beyond Huddersfield, Sheffield United and Bury before Crewe were demolished 4-1 in front of their own fans in early March. It meant that on the first day of April, Forest was 6 games away and top of the pops with 80 points.
Williams kick looking for Van Hooijdonk, essentially the player in the way as Van Hooijdonk went down again. Johnson this time! And here's Bart Williams, and he's through here! And in the end, Forest will say it doesn't matter how you played as long.
Van Hooijdonk, starting again, oh he rode that brilliantly, gets the shot and it's deflected, it's there! They've taken the lead against the Brussels, the champions in championship style.
Nottingham Forest were back in the big time where they and the squad they had assembled belonged, and yet it was a disaster before it got going. What is the best practice as you re-enter a top flight of a division? Probably not sell one of the star strikers that helped get you there, right? Well, go and tell Nottingham Forest that if you have time machines, because they decided to ship Kevin Campbell off to Trabzonspor for £2.5 million. Now, Pierre Van Hooijdonk didn't like that, so he protested it by simply not turning up to work. We've all done that, haven't we, lads? With the hottest league in world football, Forest turned up and in one fell swoop they had lost their entire attacking impetus. With Colin Cooper also chipping, returning back to Middlesbrough, Bassett replaced the mini exodus with a calibre of player that read Nigel Quashie, Dougie Freedman and Neil Shipley. And I'll let you be the judge of if they were in a stronger position in 1994 or 98.
Win inspired by Duncan Ferguson.
Like a game for Ferguson.
Went that well. Kazaragi's in the box. Rogers, Kazaragi, and Zola. Oh, that's a...
Yeah, not great, was it? And again, not cherry-picking the results here. They were just 2 league victories between the start of the season and when Dave Bassett was ultimately sacked in December. Both coming in August when there was a spring in the club's step against what had become relegation rivals in Coventry and Southampton. Since then, they'd been eliminated by Man United in the League Cup thanks to 2 Ole Gunnar Solskjaer goals, not the last they'll see of him that season, before crashing to the bottom of the division. With Portsmouth comprehensively eliminating Forest from the 3rd round of the League Cup, Ron Atkinson was brought in 9 days later, given a completely feckless task of turning the ship around. In the back 9 of his managerial career and clearly turning his attention to commentary, hopefully with one eye on when ITV were actually recording him, Forest had 17 matches left and 7 points to make up on Coventry. Instantly he attempted to bring Forest up to speed, spending £1.1 million on Carlton Palmer from Southampton. He got off to a good enough start, restricting Arsenal to just a 1-0 win at the City Ground despite sitting in the wrong dugout before he headed on up to Goodison Park and claimed 3 points. With his former club Manchester United the next visitors to Nottingham, was this the start of a great escape?
Scholes, and a very simple goal. Cole chasing, still Cole, and it's 2-1 Manchester United. 2 going for the same ball, and Besant this time. Harks managed to get a foot in, oh, and deflected off the post, up on the neck, and it's another one. And Besant does well yet again, but there's more to do. Oh, that's brilliant, that is brilliant. Oh, that's a lovely play, and Solskjaer! They're just queuing up, and it's Solskjaer again.
When Nottingham Forest, champions of England and Europe formerly, were relegated again in 1999, nobody expected them to be gone for nearly a quarter of a century. This is the story of the wilderness years at the City Ground, of 29 managers in 23 years from the Premier League to the third tier and back again. The club, it was in tatters. The Bridgeford Consortium disbanded. Nigel Reid quit as chairman on April 13th, with everybody's favourite credit rating company, Experian, Eric Barnes, replacing him. He'd pushed for Nigel Doherty, who in turn made a substantial investment into the club. With big wrong, big fucking off, there was a new manager in town and he went by the name of David Platt. He had had just one managerial job and he had been there as Sampdoria, who were about to get relegated to Serie B. So a good omen then. With that in mind, he attempted to capitalise on the Italian market. Moreno, Manini, Salvatore Matricano and Gianluca Petracchi all came in. They made less than 30 appearances between them. Also in through the door were Stern John and Ricardo Scamecca on permanent deals, with the experience of Ian Wright into the building on a 2-month loan. That loan market would be further exploited later on in the season for John Terry, who turned out for the club 5 times, and Ben Olsen as well, although his stint was marred by a broken ankle.
Waiting in the middle, it's gone beyond him and turned in by Lou. To Forest. Marino this time has picked himself up and got away from Moses. And he's managed to get it to Baudelaire! But Williams to take it. It's 1-1!
Now it probably sums up Nottingham Forest 99-2000 season when I say that fullback Alan Rodgers was the joint top scorer, hardly in the goal scoring mould of a Stuart Pearce, getting bucket loads from dead ball situations. This was a club firmly on the wane. They would finish 14th upon their return to the second tier of the game.
And some space and has got inside Pennock. 1-0 Nottingham Forest. Finds Roberts, turns away from 2 challenges, gets the shot in, that's a wonderful goal!
Forest had been able to borrow £5 million as the cost of the game spiralled out of control. Now their overdraft was busy, topping out at £8.5 million. Of course, it made room for David Johnson's signature in from Ipswich Town in January. Whilst his former club would be promoted to the Premier League for the first time in 6 years, Nottingham Forest were mooching about the place looking glum, sitting in 11th place after another ropey old season.
Certainly Clements is a favourite. Neil Clements! Ew, it's not gone in, it has now!
The 01-02 campaign in Football League circles anyway would become known as the season where ITV Digital collapsed. With clubs threatening to go to the wall every other day, Forest's bubble had just about burst. Treading a fine line financially anyway, they slumped to 16th place in Division 1. The only thing that held any promise at the City Ground these days was the promotion of Paul Hart from the academy and into the senior hot seat. With him, he promoted the youth of tomorrow at the club, of which there was an abundance, from David Prutton to Andy Reid and Gareth Williams, the latter of which named Club Player of the Season. Forest had an incredible wealth of talent from the reserves. Unfortunately, their club finances would have to hinge on sales like the £5 million they procured from Newcastle United in January 02 for the signature of Jermaine Genius, and so the cosmic ballet carried on.
For Forest's third goal before half-time.
Stayed there by Dawson, and this is Miller. Still Miller!
Fulham's rivals. The Reds were certainly quick out of the blocks and had established a 2-0 lead.
In the summer of 02, Des Walker returned and he would help out another Forest graduate in Michael Dawson at the heart of defence. The academy did not stop producing talent, as up front was the man mountain himself, Marlon Harewood, who had started to find the net with more regularity. Then supplementing him, you had David Huckabee, who arrived on loan late on in the season. He bagged himself 5 goals in the last 9 matches to push Forest into the playoff picture. Squeaking into 6th place ahead of the relegated Ipswich Town, Nottingham Forest would be paired off with Sheffield United, who under Neil Warnock were about to play their 3rd semi-final in what had been a rollercoaster season. Unfortunately, Nottingham Forest couldn't pertain to be a Liverpool or an Arsenal, the calibre of teams that had blunted the blades in their previous semi-finals that season. However, even with defeat, there was a promise about the City ground once again. After all, they had effectively been 2 wins away from a return to the Premier League and had done everything the right way. That seemingly was about to continue as they beat the relegated Sunderland to begin the 03-04 season before taking the names of Coventry, Norwich, Sheffield United and Burnley before September was out.
The neat pass. Harewood now slips it through. It's a lovely ball. Andy Reid, great bit of skill. It's got past Warner.
He's skipped away from Reid. And he's delivered for Defoe. And
despite all the good work he had done on a limited budget relying on free transfers and academy prospects, Paul Hart was sacked after a loss to Coventry on February 7th. The club had fallen into the drop zone, but with 17 matches left and only a 2-point deficit to make up, with a decent enough goal difference and a game in hand. If you thought the spiral had begun already, just watch this old shit. Joe Kinnear was announced as a new Nottingham Forest manager.
Reid, man on the overlap, but Reid might not need him. Terrific goal.
The attack, and eventually it was Tommy Johnson with the winner, and 3.
Seems mental to think about now, but there was a spot of chatter about Forest and designs on promotion. Rest assured, all that had pissed off once it took them 10 games and until September 26th to pick up a league victory when West Ham came to visit. Kinnear was gone by December, only able to mastermind 4 league wins, all at home, as Wolves, Reading and QPR were added to the list. Without a manager, Forest were 9 days out from Christmas and in the relegation zone alongside such luminaries as Gillingham and Rotherham. Stepping in on a caretaker basis was Mick Harford before the role of Nottingham Forest manager was finally re-legitimised once again with the appointment of Gary Megson. Before he could get his feet comfortable under the table, the ownership took a chainsaw to that table by selling off Forest's 2 finest young talents, Andy Reid and Michael Dawson, on January deadline day for a combined £8 million. And so there was only so much Gary Megson could do. Forest were relegated, making them the first European Cup winners to drift down into the 3rd tier of their league system. They'd gone on a run of 1 loss from 10 matches between January 22nd and April the 2nd, but the problem was a distinct lack of victories in the second half of the campaign. They signed off with a draw against Gillingham, who also went down. Gillingham would never be back to this level. How long would it take Forest?
After just 6 minutes. The Oval were looking to extend their...
Gary Megson was gone on February 16th, 24 hours after a demoralising 3-0 defeat at Oldham Athletic. They were depressingly 13th after 33 fixtures, 11 points from the playoffs and only 5 from an unthinkable relegation down to League 2. Now Ian McParlin and Frank Barlow were left to sweep up what was a hurricane of piss. Results certainly picked up in Megson's absence, with only 1 defeat to speak of away at Hartlepool on April 22nd, and that defeat would prove the difference between Forest backdooring their way into the playoffs and having the strife of another 3rd tier campaign as a caretaker unit presided over 8 wins on the back 9 of the season, but ultimately they were unable to be victorious in any of their last 3. It constituted the club's record lowest finish. The summer of 2006 marked the return of Colin Calderwood as manager in the hope of bringing some stability to proceedings. The manager was adamant in injecting some youth into the squad, so Junior Agogo was signed, and he also had the likes of Lewis McGugan coming through the academy as well. It was an incredible start to the season, 100% in the first few weeks, save for a point up at Huddersfield. In fact, their loss at home to Oldham on September the 12th, that's their only defeat in the first 2 months of the season. It had been such a good start to the campaign that Forest sat top on Christmas Day, 3 points ahead of Bristol City in the playoffs with exactly half of the season played. Whilst they were able to stay the course, finishing second, a more inconsistent second half of the season saw Forest slump to 4th on 82 points, 3 short of the automatics. With a field also containing Oldham and Blackpool, Forest were faced off with Yeovil in the playoffs. Yeovil, a team who Forest had done the double over in the regular season with a pair of 1-0 triumphs.
To move for him. Davies! And Yeovil! Gugan's corner, and it's in! Malala to have a go, and it's off the post, and it's gone back in off right! And here's Lindegaard. In goes Stewart! They've only gone and done it! Fallen short. Morris is in here! Lee Morris for you! Job not done yet. Gary Holt! outstanding via the deflection. It's Aaron Davies. He could win it. He probably has won it.
But the form book often goes out of the window in the playoffs. It looked as though Forest were stuck here for good. Calderwood shipped out players on big wages and therefore experience, whilst young talent like Chris Coleman was coming in. Forest were adapting to being in League One for the long haul. It was a campaign that didn't start in the best light. Forest picked up 3 points from their first 4 matches and didn't record a win until a trip to Port Vale in September. But then the season got going, turbocharged by 3 clean sheets and 3 victories to end September, as only 2 further matches were lost in advance of Christmas. With baubles being smashed on the Trent, Forest went so far as to lead the league again on Christmas Day, this time more precariously, as the top 9 were split by just 6 points. The quality of the division meant that the second half of the campaign was very much Ming Vaz territory. Just as long as Forest didn't fuck up too much, they'd get at least a chance at a playoff. In the end, they did enough to go up automatically, with 2008 beginning with home victories over Huddersfield and Leyton Orient, before a dearth of results in advance of a February which saw Millwall, Swindon and Leyton Orient again fall victim to Forest. Ending the season with 19 points from a possible 21 took them from a playoff berth to automatic promotion in second. Forest's impeccable start to the final day's fixture against Yeovil at the City Ground enough to confirm a return to the Championship, as ghosts of the past were slain. They never would return to this level of football.
That's a good layoff, and that's Jones to hit it.
Holland's header is a poor one. Here's Rob Earnshaw. More problems for Charlton.
Colin Calderwood went big in the market, the headline being Robert Earnshaw's signature from the laughably relegated Derby County for £3 million. Not that it appeared to count for shit all. Merry Christmas, Colin Calderwood was sacked after a 4-2 loss at home to Doncaster Rovers on Boxing Day. John Pemberton's caretaker game in charge had them winning 3-2 at Norwich to help them out of the drop zone for the first time in months. From there, enter Billy Davies. Again, Forest craved some stability, especially now they were in the Championship. From being stuck in the bottom 3 on Christmas Day, Forest would eventually wind up safe enough in 19th place. The foundations were beginning to be laid. Once survival was achieved, the transfer market was tickled once again. Chris Gunter, Paul McKenna, David McGoldrick, Paul Anderson, Lee Camp and Dexter Blackstock all acquired for the new season. It had been a slow start to life in his first full Championship season at the City Ground for Billy Davies. The one win they did get in the opening weeks, however, the sweetest of the lot, 3-2 at home to Derby. However, once Blackpool had stripped Forest of a potential 3 points on September 19th, Davies' men wouldn't so much as lose a game until January the 30th and a trip to Pride Park. Even in spite of that loss, Forest occupied an automatic promotion spot. They seemed destined to return to the Premier League in double quick time. Of their remaining 18 games, however, Forest won just 8, which was enough to take them out of the automatic conversation and into the playoffs. Despite their low points tally of 79, they claimed third and would, in theory, face the weakest playoff team. Blackpool, who had beaten Forest home and away in the league, did so once again, making it 4 from 4 against the Seasiders, who eventually would spend just the one season in the top flight. Forest would be waiting for them upon their return.
Ready to step up now, left-footed, and blazes it over the crossbar.
Good ball to him from McKenna. Level with the edge of the box. He goes backwards now for McGugan. McGugan's cross. Oh, and a great diving header! Ahead of him again to his right, and he crosses. And Earnshaw pokes it in from 6 yards out.
Lewis McGugan was in inspired form, and eventually Forest finally turned their performances into victories after a 5-game winless start to the 2010-11 season. Just as Forest were motoring on up the league, a November 20th victory at Cardiff included, Dexter Blackstock's knee ligaments completely went, ruling him out for the season. Thankfully though, the loan market was still just about open, so in came Marcus Tudgay, whilst Aaron Ramsey followed, also in loan, in January. After losing their next game at Leicester, Forest wouldn't lose in the league at all until February 16th, before their 18-month unbeaten run at home in the league was over in March thanks to Hull. Then followed a bit of a slump, but Forest would claim 15 points from their final 6 matches to qualify for the playoffs, where they'd meet Swansea, whom they had traded 3 points with in the 2 games from the normal season.
Back to the Scotsman, and now infield towards Leon Britton, 25 yards out after the short corner. Britton now edge of the penalty area, twists away from Tudgay, left foot short. Oh, here's Dobie linking up with Dyer and running towards the top of the D, and away from Chambers, 2-0. And they cleared a halfway, but that's a great ball. Inside right channel, and Robert Shaw to try and prize them open. McGugan laying it off for Earnshaw. Earnshaw has hit the post. Bradley to halfway, shoots the goal, and finds the empty net.
Billy Davies was gone. Nigel Doherty, after placing 75 million quid of his own money into the club, simply couldn't countenance another bean to get Forest over the line after 2 failed attempts at Premier League promotion via the playoffs. Steve McLaren was known around these parts for his assistant manager work at Derby, and he had rehabilitated his image in the Netherlands after failing to get England into Euro 2008. It wasn't as if Forest didn't spend any money. Fulham's Jonathan Greening, Matt Derbyshire from Olympiacos, as well as Ismail Miller and Andy Reid were all acquired ahead of the 2011-12 campaign.
Taylor, Nolan swung at it and followed in by Winston. Good turn by McAnuff. Did well to get the ball in as well towards Noel Hunt.
It was officially a shit show. Steve McLaren resigned by October, Nigel Doherty followed him out, and replacing them were Steve Cottrell and Frank Clark respectively, as Doherty's February death hung over the club long after he was gone. And if you thought things were bad now, say hello to the Al-Hazawi family. Forest were twerking for that new cash, and desperately they clung on to the Q80s for life. And just what did that cash buy you? A new manager apparently, as Cottrell was quickly sacked. In his place came a bewildered Sean O'Driscoll, promoted from assistant. Oh, and by the way, Forest finished 19th on just 50 points, but safe by 10 given the lack of quality and a Portsmouth points deduction. Forest continued to spend, the signing not limited to Henry Lansbury, Simon Cox and Danny Collins on permanent deals, whilst loans were arranged for a glut of talent, included Sam Hutchinson, Alan Hutton and Gonzalo Higuera.
Now Blackstock onto Lewis McGugan. McGugan! Oh, that's magnificent!
On his delivery, and it's in!
Now that Boxing Day table looks a bit better, doesn't it? The owners didn't think so. O'Driscoll was for the chop and Alex McLeish was hired. 6 weeks later, he too was gone. Billy Davies parachuted back in as the merry-go-round spun faster than ever and spat Forest out into 8th, the same place it has been around the festive period, meaning all that upheaval was for nothing.
This is Abdoun having a run into the penalty area. Crosses. Halford heads in.
Took it away from both Cox and Henderson. Here's Andy Reid.
Nobody surely had Billy Davies lasting longer than a year on their bingo card. Presumably, the Al-Hazawis forgot too and promptly sacked him 13 months into his second reign after a loss to Derby. After that 5-0 humiliation, Forest were in 7th place, one better than when Davies was reunited with the club. From a 2-point deficit to make up, Forest wound up in 11th, 7 points away from second chance at promotion via the playoffs. Ahead of the 2014-15 campaign, Stuart Pearce was announced as the new manager. Again, they went big in the market. Matty Fryatt, Chris Burke and Michael Mancien added, whilst both Carl Darlow and Jamal Lascelles cashed in on, but they both ultimately returned on loan, which allowed for 2 more signatures, Britta Sombalonga and Michael Antonio up front.
On towards the edge of the penalty area, the youngster goes on!
If their previous match against Derby was a 5-0 humiliation, their September 14th draw at home to the Rams was even more disastrous. Chris Coleman went down to a season-ending knee injury, whilst Andy Reid's return was curtailed by a long-term injury. Keep in mind that this was a club now stalling through a transfer embargo after falling foul of FFP, with another manager sacked after less than a year. Goodbye, Stuart Pearce. Dougie Freedman was the next cab off the rank, and his first home win on February 11th against Wigan was marred by another horrific injury, this time to Britta Sombalonga. The club mercifully perhaps finished in the beige seat of 14th, as the real lack of quality in their ownership sabotaged them on the pitch. There was one word for it, and it was circus. From the wild rotations of managers, Paul Williams in March 2016, Philippe Montagnier that June, before Mark Warburton was hired in March, with the club finally looking bereft and glancing over their shoulder at relegation in 2017. After another season of mid-table fluff in 2016, Forest went into the final day of the subsequent campaign only one goal above the dotted line. They simply needed to better Blackburn's result when Ipswich came to visit to stay afloat. 3 goals, 2 of which from a Sombalonga, just about kept Forest in the Championship, right on time for a massive sea change on the Trent. In May 2017, Evangelos Marinakis was unveiled as a new Nottingham Forest owner at a financial cost of £50 million and under the cloud of match-fixing allegations. Both on and off the pitch, it appeared as though the club was jumping from one clown show to another. New Year's Eve was marked with the sacking of yet another manager, with Mark Warburton presiding over 14th place and just 1 win from 7 games.
Away yet, Holding's header, and here's Eric Lee high! Oh, that's a... And he scored it! It is 4 for Nottingham Forest!
Aitor Karanka had been out of work since he was sacked midway through Middlesbrough's only Premier League season since 2009. He had of course taken the Teessiders up, so it was hoped that he could replicate that further south. As Marinakis allegedly graduated from match fixing to drug smuggling in his homeland, Forest were no nearer better days by finishing a miserable 17th place in the 2017-18 campaign. The Guardian's Championship preview for the upcoming 2018-19 season went as follows. Over the last 12 months, the club has improved beyond all recognition. Out goes a clueless narcissist, in comes an owner who likes to stay in the background and let a team of professionals run things. Which didn't really corroborate with what was happening on the pitch, as another New Year sacking quickly approached when Karanka was subbed out for club legend Martin O'Neill. Their 11th full-time manager in 7 years, O'Neill was given until June to prove himself at the City Ground, as he took them from 9th on January 15th all the way to 9th come the end of the season, 8 points off Derby in the playoffs. O'Neill faced the chop, and in came Sabri Lamouchi, whose managerial experience extended to Ivory Coast, Qatar and most recently Rennes, where he got them into the Europa League. Besides an opening day loss at home to West Brom, things were actually going quite well. Then a pandemic turned up and postponed any joy. The club was sat in 5th place when football was seemingly postponed indefinitely, only to return in June as part of Project Restart. Forest would win just 2 matches in advance of the July 22nd final day visit of Stoke City to the City Ground. All they needed to do was avoid a massive goal swing as their playoff rival Swansea travelled to Reading. Waiting for Forest seemingly were one of West Brom, Brentford or Fulham, before an empty Wembley final. In one fell swoop, Forest had descended from 5th to 7th. A 3-point swing and a 6-goal swing meant the Welsh sides of Cardiff and Swansea would be the ones participating in the playoffs instead of them. After a poor start to the delayed 2020-21 season, Lamucci was never going to be given patience from an already trigger-happy owner.
Tees towards Ribeiro, and he's found the bottom corner.
And that too, of course, was always going to be the case for his successor Chris Hughton as well. After the club went backwards to 17th place once again, 9 points ahead of the drop and a massive 25 away from the playoffs, Hughton would not be forgiven if the 21-22 season began poorly. And after a 2-0 home loss to Middlesbrough, he was of course sacked, with the club's only point from 7 games that season coming away at Pride Park. After agreeing compensation with Swansea City, despite Steve Cooper leaving the Welsh club that summer, Forest had their new manager. Chances are that he would last over a year were thin, to say the least. The effect was instant as Forest lost just 1 game under Cooper in advance of Christmas Day, as they rose to being on the precipice of the playoffs, just a point behind Stoke City in 7th. Cooper's complete retooling of the team continued, with Carl Jenkinson and Lyle Taylor flogged in exchange for a distinguished style of football that had nearly taken him to the Premier League a year prior in South Wales. Forest were even feeling the benefit in the academy as they reached the FA Youth Cup final, but were sadly undone at Old Trafford in front of a mammoth 67,000 spectators. But as that final hurdle wasn't cleared, Forest was staring at 3 more hurdles to a potential Premier League season. Sheffield United awaited in the playoffs, 2 teams that couldn't be split over 3 hours of regular season football. Beyond that, the potential of either Huddersfield Town or Luton Town. The stars were beginning to align. In London, they call everybody's second favourite team, apparently. Well, in the 90s, they looked destined to drift out of the Football League. Then Muhammad Al-Fayed purchased the club, injected a bit of chaos and, crucially, money into the mix. This is the rise of Fulham Football Club.
Al-Fayed can afford himself a smile. The first part of his dream under Kevin Keegan has come true. What a night for Fulham Football Club.
Let's not dial it back too far today. We'll visit the misty-eyed 19th century of Fulham, I'm sure, in a future video. But let's start here. Fulham Park Rangers, a 3-word obituary for any Fulham supporter in the late 80s. Crimson Chin himself, Jimmy Hill, was the man sweeping to the rescue of the football club as it perilously skirted with the edges of inexistence. Fulham had recently been relegated to the 3rd tier after a yo-yoing time of it in the 70s. Long gone were the days of Bobby Moore, George Best and Rodney Marsh, as well as an FA Cup final, never mind the top-flight era of the 60s. But it was due to get worse before it got better. With the advent of the 90s, the Cottagers languished dangerously close to relegation to the 4th division. This is a club that hadn't played in the basement of English football since 1932. The inevitable finally happened in '94 after 21st place now meant demotion to the 4th tier of the game. They didn't rattle right back up the divisions like they had come quite handy at doing in the 80s or become quite famous for in more recent times. Instead, the nadir was reached on February the 10th, 1996. Hartlepool United came to town, got a point out of Fulham. They were second from last in the Football League, only 6 points ahead of the only relegation spot occupied by Torquay United. Now we know that Stevenage Borough stood no chance of making their first place in the conference a promotion reality due to missing the mark of Football League's requirements, but back in February '96 Fulham weren't to know that. Their very existence was at threat. Enter Mickey Adams. He'd been at the club since 1994 after a fairly successful spell at Southampton as a budding fullback. His former manager at the Dale, Ian Branfoot, took him in and under his wing as a player coach. Now Branfoot was gone, the 34-year-old Adams was now asked to drag Fulham out of the mire. The effect? Instant. Exeter beaten in what was the club's second victory of the year. Then once Doncaster, Cardiff, Leyton Orient and Plymouth were all vanquished too, could the club breathe a huge sigh of relief. The record books now state Fulham finished 17th on 53 points, some 24 ahead of the eventually not relegated Torquay United. They do not tell just how fragile Fulham had been, and they wouldn't because of what Mickey Adams was able to do next.
Oh, what a goal! It might have actually come. First pick for the action here. Herrera's cross. And they're in front. Well, there's nothing typical about that.
Any manager handed a 5-year deal, especially in the fourth tier of English football, knows he's not really going to be there for 5 years. But on this form, Mickey Adams could have signed a 10-year deal and it still wouldn't have been enough. Fulham had long sealed their promotion back to the third tier with a 0-0 draw at Mansfield on April the 8th. They'd eventually claimed the title by one solitary goal, but a massive 15 points ahead of fourth place Northampton Town. Everything at Craven Cottage was changing. We just didn't know how violent those changes would be until the summer of 1997. May 29th, 1997, that was the date Fulham FC changed forever. That was the date when Muhammad Al-Fayed was announced as the club's new owner. Famously owner of Harrods, he's shot into the public eye by scooping up 30% of House of Fraser back in the mid-80s. Now, he was expanding his empire into sport. Not knowing a lick about football, he was invited to take lunch on Matthew Harding's steak at Chelsea before Jimmy Hill's abrupt Fulham departure caught his attention. Fulham would be cheaper, they'd be easier to manage, and he could have total control. This, to any billionaire, was music to the ears. The eventual sum it took to purchase the club was a paltry £6.25 million, with a further 8-figure investment needed for the squad and infrastructure that eventually bloated to 190 million quid, but still, it turned out to be an incredible deal. Again, like any billionaire, he wasn't shy of bombast, declaring that Fulham would be the Manchester United of the South. Premier League football as well was possible within 5 years, apparently, for this club that had finished 3 points ahead of Carlisle United. It wouldn't have taken long for Mickey Adams to get paranoid if he was that way inclined, given that Al-Fayed was flaunting Kevin Keegan about town. The rumour mill was in overdrive. Keegan to Fulham was the inevitable conclusion reached for.
And Fulham finally won it. But having finally notched his first goal for the club, Paul Moody was to curl in a second.
Not instantly, although it may well have been, as Mickey Adams broke numerous transfer records in acquiring talent like Paul Moody and Steve Hayward for 6 figures, but mere weeks after signing a boatload of players and this footage from a home win over Plymouth, the inevitable finally happened. Mickey Adams was gone 8 months into a 5-year deal.
We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident and that her partner, Dodi Fayed, has also been killed. They were apparently being pursued by paparazzi on 2 motorcycles.
Now you're armed with that slice of context, any normal conclusion would be of an emotional father making poor business decisions, but there was nothing of the sort involved in the Mickey Adams deal. Al-Fayed had likely long decided that he needed somebody else in the hot seat at Craven Cottage. Kevin Keegan was the unsurprising man in, but in the surprising position of Chief Operating Officer, just another name for Director of Football, whilst Ray Wilkins took on the job of Fulham manager. Now it was said the great Muhammad Al-Fayed empire of Fulham FC could begin.
Paul Bracewell then found Pescisolido in the second half. And Paul Watson scored his first goal of the season, but Fulham weren't down and out. And Matthew Brazier hammered home the equaliser.
He had demanded the league title, and that ambition was taken up another notch in the transfer market once Mickey Adams had been chopped. From Paul's Bracewell and Pesky Solido, the real measure of intent was seen in the £2.1 million acquisition of Chris Coleman from Premier League Blackburn Rovers. For any normal club rising from the 4th tier to put on a half-baked automatic promotion push, which ultimately faltered due to inconsistencies on the final straight, that'd have been enough. Settle for the playoffs, move on. But didn't you know now that Fulham were no ordinary club? After losing their last 3 fixtures to position themselves well within the playoffs nonetheless and confirm a semi-final against Grimsby, Ray Wilkins was spectacularly binned off. In his place, with 2 ties ahead of a potential Wembley final, was the man you suspect Al-Fayed had wanted all along. Kevin Keegan was to be Fulham manager, belatedly.
It's Peter Beardsley. It's 1-0 to the 10 men. Fulham 1, Grimsby 0. Past David Smith. And it's in, it's 1-1. Oh, here's Donovan. And it's there, 10 minutes to go.
But it didn't guarantee success. A week after the Grimsby debacle, Kevin Keegan was given the job on a permanent basis. The plan still remained. Fulham not only must be promoted, but they had to be a Premier League unit by 2002. The transfer activity was never going to relent. John Solarco and Jeff Horsfield, the big names up front, whilst Gus Ullenbeek and Kit Simons refreshed the backline. With an increasingly star-studded team and a famous manager at the helm, it was now promotion or bust.
It's his free kick to Hayward, and Lehman tries to divert it in.
2 substitutions, one against Liverpool, one against Manchester United, and now here's Horsfield! Here he is with his right, flicking it up towards Albert, and Philip Albert!
And Horsfield, 24 goals this season, comes through, it's fallen for Hales, he can put it in!
3 men in the box, one of them is Moody! Paul Moody has scored!
So promotion it was by quite some distance, as it turned out in the end, a staggering 101 points. As a football team, nobody had come close to this since Swindon Town's 4th tier 102-point effort in the 1985-86 season. As a 3rd tier record, however, Fulham had edged out Bournemouth's 97 points from 1987. In any other season, it would have run away with the records and the headlines, had Sunderland not just posted 105 points in the division above to reach the Premier League. That now had become Fulham's goal. Outside of league competition, Fulham had had their brushes with greatness, only bowing out at stadia like Anfield in the 3rd round of the League Cup and at the home of the eventual treble winners Manchester United in the 5th round of the FA Cup. But there had already been a wee spanner chucked in the works. England had arrived with an opportunity hard to turn down for Keegan. They had to bring someone likeable in after their last manager had just told the world that disabled people were being punished for sins in a previous life, and he hid it behind a religious excuse. It wasn't as if England had kicked on though since France 98, losing to their only real rivals for Euro 2000 qualification in Stockholm before drawing at home to Bulgaria. Keegan would improve matters, but only slightly, earning 5 points from his 3 competitive fixtures. Now he was left with a dilemma. In acquiring a mix of youth and experience from Steve Finnan to Barry Hales and Peter Beardsley, Fulham were clearly signing a team for the Premier League. Alas, the pull of the national team proved too much. 2 weeks after confirming promotion with a win over Gillingham, the announcement was made: Keegan to England. He'd scraped the country into Euro 2000 where, despite their first tournament win over Germany since the blindingly obvious, they'd bounce out of the groups. He'd end up resigning in the literal bowels of Wembley after Demandschaft had gotten their revenge in the stadium's final game.
Now for Horsfield, the flag stays down, still Horsfield, and he's hit the bar, and the follow-up is in the back of the net.
Away though, and there's a chance here for Paul Pesky Solido.
Paul Bracewell had been promoted from assistant manager to the manager. In the meantime, the club continued to look upwards, moving to the state-of-the-art training facility known as Motspur Park. Meanwhile, the transfer wheels kept on turning. Alan Melville was acquired for defence, whilst Lee Clark came into midfield, and both Karl-Heinz Riedler and Stan Collymore were signed for the attack. And yet, amidst a 27-game unbeaten run in the league at the Cottage and Al-Fayed attempting to buy the Twin Towers, no, not them ones, they ran out of steam just before Christmas and were never really able to get going again. In Leicester, they found an unfortunate rival in the quarter-finals of the League Cup, only bowing out on penalties to the eventual champions, whilst the Foxes' Wembley foes, Tranmere, dumped Fulham more annoyingly out of the FA Cup 5th round shortly thereafter. Naturally, Al-Fayed was quick to move, cutting Bracewell after a loss at Portman Road in March 2000, with the club apparently unforgivably sat in 10th with their playoff dreams dashed. Karl-Heinz Riedler was the man promoted to the hot seat, but a man quite clearly not cut out for the management. The German would flee come the end of the season after leaving the coaching to his assistants. The next man would have a better idea.
It will be now if Sahar can put this away. It probably is over.
Shot, and Louis Sahar is clean through here. Should be 2-0, and it is.
Jean Tigana was the man acquired for the next phase of the Al-Fayed project. Formerly the hero that helped bring France Euro 84 in his playing days, now he was busy winning as a manager as well. He'd scooped up the French title as Monaco boss and had taken a team with talent like Thierry Henry and David Trezeguet to the Champions League semi-finals ahead of teams like Alex Ferguson's Manchester United. As Al-Fayed squirreled away in the background, forming what would become one of the more formidable women's teams in Europe before sadly pulling the funding due to his impatience on the English women's game's professionalism, Tigana got to work on the men's side of things. One of the first pieces of business he got done was bringing a young Louis Sahar from Metz for £2.1 million. Derided from his short time at Newcastle, the Frenchman would become prolific, given a season to adapt in a lower division. Naturally, that was not all. Luis Boamote signed to accompany Sahar up front, whilst the experienced John Collins knitted everything together behind them. Following in Arsene Wenger's footsteps, Tigana adopted a more continental, more professional style to what was still a British-centric game. The rewards, predictably, were reaped.
Great work from Sahar. Right, Fantastica!
Goldbeck. Sahar's there! Towards Davis, and Friedler's dropped it, and Sahar has scored!
Another 101 points, Fulham racked up 30 wins from 46 fixtures and eventually finished 14 points ahead of Bolton, sealing promotion away at Huddersfield with 5 games to spare. The one casualty from the season was Chris Coleman's career-ending car crash in January 01 that not only broke his leg but his ankle, and on top of that, ruptured his ACL. He'd become important again later on. He'd be quickly replaced on the team sheet by Alan Goma at a £4 million fee from Newcastle. Then, in the summer, they went a bit mad. The statement of intent had already been acquired when the £70 million development of Craven Cottage was signed off on in February, but then came the stars that would adorn that new stadium. How about Edwin van der Sar from Juventus? If you wanted outfield players to quench your thirst, there's a French duo of Steve Malbranc and Sylvain Legwinski, who were swapping big teams in Lyon and Bordeaux to join Fulham. Whilst the hunt for a striker floundered with the attempts to sign Freddie Canute and Teddy Sheringham, another Frenchman in Steve Marley, even at a ludicrous $11.5 million, was seen as a positive at the time. Fulham were officially Premier League ready.
Beautifully brought down by Sahar! Fulham's
post with a goal just before half-time from Legwinski, and after a second from Malbranc, only too late.
Right from the off, it was obvious that Fulham belonged, from holding their own on the opening day at Old Trafford in spite of a loss, to 5 points against teams that would become mid-table rivals in Sunderland, Derby and Charlton. It was a solid opening. The season got better as West Ham were sworn off at Upton Park and Craven Cottage became a tough place to come and play football. Chelsea and Leeds were held there, while Southampton, Newcastle and Everton all walked away empty-handed. Come Christmas, Fulham were in the top half, sitting on 23 points with a game in hand. Relegation was 7 points behind them, with Champions League football almost as close. They were mid-table as fuck, but a good mid-table as fuck, since this was a golden era of a Big Six before the Big Six: United, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Leeds and Newcastle, with handy teams in Spurs, Villa and Everton, not to mention the upstarts of Blackburn, Charlton, Sunderland and Ipswich, who had rocked the boat, and Fulham were right there in the mix. And they weren't stopping. John Carew was in the building for a medical after a proposed £7.5 million switch from Valencia. Ultimately, a knee complaint would show up and Al-Fayed backed out of the transfer.
For half-time, a more scrappy effort than his previous one did make the net.
Malbranc,
and he scores!
The balance sheet may well have said 24 million quid lost, the biggest at the time in British football's history, but Fulham fans had a fucking good time of it. Back in the big time for 33 years and finishing a comfortable 13th was good enough. Then you had the cup run, which took the Cottagers beyond Walsall and West Brom before being only eliminated at the semi-final stage against Chelsea. It was an almighty season. Then the cracks. Franco Baresi came through the door, not as a player obviously, Al-Fayed wasn't that mad, but as a director of football. He lasted 82 days. Fulham signed a player who liked to dress up as Zorro, as well as an attempt to cash grab on the East Asian market, and then the season started.
Inamoto slides it on Sava, Inamoto, great football! Oh, what a super...
But the fact is, they've been all over the place in these closing stages. Legwinski!
Now Marley. Davies, who's looking quick down the centre, is hit, be pulled down, hit by Sava!
It's the in-swinger, and they've got their goal as well, and the man who's got it is Stephen finally.
To look at a record of Fulham on Christmas Day between their first and second seasons is to not see a great deal of difference. They'd won one more game, gained one fewer point, they were further down the table, but not really that much nearer relegation, which should always have been the aim. And then they had done so with the distraction of Europe. First with 8 games of classic inter-toto football, which always had a trip to Scandinavia, one to southeastern Europe, and then a couple of light games against Big Five league opposition. Then have 2 victorious journeys in difficult trips to Croatia in the UEFA Cup, combined with a hard-luck tale from the third round against German opposition, as well as continued form back home. It was a good season. They finished 4 points better off in the league, albeit 2 closer to relegation, but had racked up 3 more wins and 5 more goals. This, with the added context that they were playing at Loftus Road for the first of 2 seasons during Craven Cottage's redevelopment, despite an attempt at ground sharing with Chelsea with a permanent view. But the bloom had long been off the rose regarding Tigana and Al-Fayed. When the owner got it in his head that he wanted someone gone, they were gone. It was announced on March 26th, the club 13th, that Tigana's contract would not be renewed. After defeats against Blackburn and Liverpool, he was fired before he could even see that contract out. Enter an incredible roll of the dice.
It's a chance for Fulham second, they wrap it up.
It may be that they will, because Van Nistelrooy...
Fulham had extended an olive branch to Chris Coleman when it became obvious that he was never going to be able to play football again professionally. A job on the coaching staff was his, but a little did he know that before the season was out, he'd become the Fulham manager, first on a temporary basis, but then permanently as the league's youngest manager, aged just 32. Also in were the trio of Mark Crossley, Mark Pembridge and Moritz 15,000 volts, combined with the sales of Steve Marley and Finnan and an inexperienced manager. It was easy to see why the Cottagers were picked out for relegation. Then the season started and teams like Borough, Spurs, Blackburn and Leicester all fell before their magnum opus, a 3-1 triumph at Old Trafford. Whilst their March return to the theatre of dreams meant the end of a decent cup run, it allowed Fulham to focus their minds on the running. They had lost their attacking fulcrum in January, Louis Saha deserting for Old Trafford in a £12 million deal. They could hardly refuse that type of money. It was Steve Marley money, after all. Fulham wound up 9th, Saha still their top scorer despite flaking out halfway through, but this time didn't need goals. They were obdurate enough at the back to maintain a top half finish. This with Coleman wrapping his team up in a 4-5-1, enough to protect them.
To take a 3-goal lead at St James's Park, Steve Malbronk against Harper, steps up right foot strike.
Difficult bouncing ball there. Oh, he's given it away to McBride.
Said it comes across to McBride. Is this the hat-trick? Cole is there anyway. It's number 6.
The 2004-5 campaign marked the return of Fulham to Craven Cottage, supposedly temporarily before sorting out a bigger stadium. Yeah, that one's gone down well. Before the season got going, they were dragged through court cases that left them having to pay out the likes of Marseille for Steve Marley and then John Tigana as well. On the pitch, however, we really started to see the Chris Coleman team. Up front came the likes of Brian McBride, Andy Cole and Collins John as Thomas Radzinski departed. Meanwhile, Carlos Bocanegra shored up the backline and Papa Bouba Diop was added to midfield. Sadly, it was the end of the road for Sean Davies, who had been with the club since the 4th tier days as he was acquired by Spurs. On the pitch, you have to say it was a regression by only 4 places but by 8 points, as a team that used to be hard to beat lost almost half their league games. There was a whiff of a League Cup run, but that was quickly extinguished by the eventual champions Chelsea, who had just welcomed Jose Mourinho and would romp to the Premier League over the next 2 seasons.
This is now Klaus Jensen. Closed very quickly. Collins John onside. And Fulham have the lead. 1-0 to the...
They're an into here, and it's come across towards Steve Malbron. Tries to get the shot away. Might fall here for Belmonte.
Belmonte. It's a terrific run by Luis Belmonte. Can he finish it? Oh, yes.
For a team that had lost experience in Van der Sar, Cole and Clark and had replaced big names with ones of the calibre of Heide Helgason, it could be chalked up as a minor miracle that Fulham actually minutely improved in the 05-06 season. It might have helped that they were out of the Cups dead early, but they improved to the tune of 1 position and 4 points as they marked the campaign with famous home wins over Liverpool and Chelsea, whilst claiming their only victory on the road in the entire season at Man City. Weeks into the 06-07 campaign, after a quiet summer in the market, headlined by the replacement of Steve Malbron with Jimmy Bullard, it looked all for nothing when the incoming midfielder had his season ended in just the 4th match. With Coleman already under pressure, there were storm clouds gathering at the cottage.
Giggs with the ball in, Saha! And now Samaras through and no offside, and it's a goal!
Fulham had been stable in the Premier League since their arrival in 2001, but they were drifting slowly back towards the Football League. Owner Muhammad Al-Fayed wasn't about to abide that one, so he hired Roy Hodgson and his new manager just about transformed Fulham into European finalists.
All but up, and there goes the final whistle. Mark Clattenburg brings an end to proceedings, and Fulham have stayed in the Premier League.
Drop for Beasley, it may do for Barton, Joey Barton!
An acceptable result in current year, but less so in 2007 when Manchester City were up to dog shit. This loss marked the end of the line for Chris Coleman and Fulham. While survival wouldn't technically be confirmed until the final day, the Cottagers had never truly been in danger in comparison to the eventually relegated Charlton and Sheffield United, as well as the surviving Wigan and West Ham. Like the cowards that they were, Coleman was sacked by Fulham after 10 years of service over the phone. His replacement was a man snapped up from the clutches of international football, Laurie Sanchez. Halfway through a qualifying campaign for Northern Ireland, a nation who hadn't reached a major tournament since 1986, they had gone toe-to-toe with Spain and Sweden. He got the call while skiing in Kitzbühel and, without an interview, was summoned to Harrods to take the Fulham job. Coleman had left him and the club one parting gift, the acquisition of New England Revolution star Clint Dempsey. He'll become much more important later on. For now, Sanchez had to decide to take the job, which he did, clawing back Dave Besant to the Cottage, who was due for the chop thanks to the ownership. The same ownership who demanded Sanchez choose Fulham or his country and not both. So if he couldn't go to Northern Ireland, he thought he'd bring Northern Ireland to Fulham. Aaron Hughes and Chris Baird were the new signings in defence, Stephen Davies brought into the midfield, and David Healy was signed to lead the line. Almost 10 million quid spent. Sanchez didn't stop there. The mad trolley dash continued with yet more bulking up of the spine, from Paul Konchesky at the back to Danny Murphy through the middle and Diamanti Camara up top. 13 players in, 13 players out.
First mistake it was by Jens Lehmann in the Arsenal goal. Dempsey scores 1-0 Fulham.
And Keane, there it is, the opener for Spurs. Not a great half so far.
Too many times Fulham couldn't hold on to leads, and too many times late goals were conceded. This can be perfectly encapsulated by the start to the season, which saw David Healy gift his side the lead at the Emirates inside of a minute, before 2 Arsenal goals in the last 6 saw 3 points turn to naught. Here's the exhaustive Laurie Sanchez experience at Craven Cottage. You ready? Let's go. Continuing on from the opening day, they led Middlesbrough after 16 matches, only to chuck in a defeat thanks to an 88th minute winner from Lee Cattermole. A week later, Sean Maloney snatched all 3 points for Villa in the final minute after Fulham had led at Villa Park on 6 minutes. A similar story 3 weeks later after that, when Jason Koumas' late equaliser stole a point for Wigan after Fulham had led for 70 minutes. They'd also led Manchester City twice 7 days beyond that before flaking out on a 3-3 draw. Same story at Sunderland on October the 27th, this time Ken Wynne-Jones equalising late on. A point was sacrificed at Anfield thanks to 2 late goals in the final 9 minutes from Torres and Gerrard on November the 10th. They led Blackburn twice, 15 days later, only for Stephen Warnock to equalise with 10 minutes left. Had games been 80 minutes long, Fulham would be 6th. As it stood, a home defeat to Newcastle on December the 15th, again thanks to a late concession, left the club in the drop zone and Loris Sanchez at the job centre considering his options. He tried to change far too much far too soon, but he had ultimately left his successor with all the tools necessary to continue.
There's Ashton and there's the equaliser.
First chance of the game, 1-0 Middlesbrough.
Coming in, Belmonte takes it on his chest and brave goalkeeping, but
Whilst Muhammad Al-Fayed, source Fulham's new manager, an old one from way back when, came and helped out. Ray Lewington, formerly of Craven Cottage for 4 years in the 80s, took charge over Christmas, being held at home to Wigan before shipping 5 at White Hart Lane. Then the new man was announced, one everybody in England had forgotten. Roy Hodgson hadn't managed in England since sending Blackburn towards the drop at the start of 98-99. In fact, his total time in England stood at 25 wins from 84 games. However, he was a hero in places like Italy, Sweden and Switzerland, and had just taken little old Finland to within a win of qualifying for Euro 2008. Initially, Al-Fayed had tried to get him on a 6-month deal, but Hodgson insisted on 2.5 years. That was enough to prize him away from Inter, where he was due to return to become sporting director. Things at the Cottage didn't look great. The only reason why Fulham weren't bottom was because of a once-in-a-lifetime bad Derby County who had just 7 points from 20 games. However, Fulham were only 2 points away from safety. Instantly, Hodgson brought in players he knew, Breda Hangeland for defence and Eric Neveland for the front line. Sadly, the experienced Jari Litmanen would be stunted by heart problems and he wouldn't get onto the pitch after signing. It wouldn't be until February the 3rd and a 2-1 triumph at home to Aston Villa that Hodgson got his first win. That wouldn't be an instant fix. Fulham failed to win for another 5 weeks and didn't score again until the March draw at Ewood Park. There was zero momentum. Brian McBride scored the winner at home to Everton on March 16th, and it was his and Bullard's returns from injury that gave Fulham finally another dimension. But not even the whipping boys of Derby could be beaten. In fact, Fulham were one of only 2 teams that wouldn't beat the record-breakingly bad Rams that season alongside Newcastle. A home defeat to Sunderland was desperation stuff, but once again Brian McBride dug Fulham out of another hole the following week, scoring in a 2-0 triumph at Reading, a team who they'd been broiled with in a relegation scrap. But the fixture list stopped relenting. The visit of Liverpool was next and they handled them comfortably 2-0, whilst a trip up to Manchester City was going even worse. Losing 2-0 at half-time as it stood, Fulham were 45 minutes away from ending their 7-year association with the Premier League.
Of the defender, has he? His camera, he's got the shot in and he's beaten Hart to take the spot kick against Joe Hart. Hart saves it, and there's Murphy, will tap in the breaking free. Can he finish? He can, and Diamanti Camera.
Fulham were safe for the time being, from certain relegation to now being just 3 points away from salvation, and fellow relegation rivals Birmingham City to come next. The Cottagers had another proverbial cup final to play in.
Inside, Jimmy Bullard swings it in with his right foot. McBride! McBride! An opportunity for Eric Neveland. Can he finish it for Fulham? Yes!
The goals of Brian McBride and Eric Neveland combined with Robbie Keane's winner for Spurs at the Medeski meant Fulham were somehow out of the drop zone ahead of the final day. The torment though was far from over. For one, the difference was only goal difference. Then you had to factor in Reading's game against the single worst Premier League team of all time in Derby. Also, Birmingham weren't yet out of it as they hosted Blackburn, who had nothing to play for.
Important. Borderline offside decision maybe, but Murphy was definitely onside. Dreadful defending from Portsmouth. Really bad defending. Nobody picking up the little midfield man, one of the smallest players on the pitch. But
thankfully, Derby weren't thrashed by 8 goals. Fulham lived to fight another day. Staying up by the skin of the teeth, Hodgson was determined not to let it happen again. By the end of May, he'd recruited 2 free transfers in Zoltan Gera for the midfield and an experienced goalkeeper in Mark Schwarzer, who had just snubbed second-choice roles at Bayern Munich and Juventus to be Fulham's number 1. It was the beginning. West Ham were raided for Bobby Zamora and John Pantzil. Everton were relieved of Andy Johnson for £10.5 million as an option to replace the injured Diamanti Camera. Meanwhile, even some of the lesser-known acquisitions in Dixon Atuhu and Chris Smalling would become important.
Overstruck the cross, but it's bounced kindly for Andrew Johnson and Fulham have the lead. It's in towards Rooney. Tevez is there at the far post, and Manchester United.
If I told you that Fulham only scored 1 more goal than they had done in the Great Escape season of 07-08, then you'd naturally be thinking of another tumultuous campaign. Instead, this was a Fulham side who had become stern in defence and solid throughout. They conceded almost half the amount they almost went down with. This was a tally that only the top three could boast. The top three, by the way, who were governed by a notoriously defensive Rafael Benitez, as well as Chelsea, who opted to match them stride for stride, whilst Manchester United set defensive records, not conceding in the league for 5 months. All in all, Fulham was 7th, with Hodgson scooping up Manager of the Year. Oh, and they qualified for Europe as well.
А Эндрю Джонсон открыл счет после великолепной комбинации хозяев до перерыва. Да и то за счет блестящего индивидуала без Замора довел дело до разгрома 3-0. И лишь после этого выяснилось...
After achieving the club's highest ever league finish after ghosting past Lithuanian and Russian opposition in qualification, Fulham had a full-blown European schedule at least until Christmas to contend with. From their position as the lowest ranked side from Pot 3, they'd be drawn the highest ranked Pot 4 outfit in CSKA Sofia, together with giant killers FC Basel and the great AS Roma. Not much was added to the squad. Jonathan Greening brought in on loan from West Brom, the lesser-known Risa brother from Lillestrøm, as well as Stephen Kelly on a free from Birmingham. The headline name, of course, came from the recently relegated Newcastle, Damien Duff. But was it enough to hang in Europe?
I tell you what I'm gonna do, first chance I get, kid, I'm out of this small town shithole.
Bobby Zamora had shunned the criticism he was getting, as well as a £5 million move that had been agreed with Hull. Ultimately, he would be vindicated for that come the final match day of the groups, after sneaking by Basel on home soil, as well as being unfortunate to have been beaten by Roma in the Olimpico, as Alton Gera winner against CSKA Sofia on match day 5 had left things cut and dry going to Switzerland for the final group game. A Fulham win and they were through. Zamora came up big time at St Jakob Park, netting 2 in Fulham's 3-2 win, which just about changed the club's season. And you'd have thought that these swanky soirees to places like Italy, Bulgaria, Switzerland would have a detrimental effect on things back home, but they didn't. Here they were on Christmas Day, sat comfortably in 9th. And whilst they would eventually sag into the bottom half, it was completely understandable, given what was to come around the corner. From going down to 9 men against Roma to ending Basel's long European winning streak at home, now they were busy dumping out the reigning champions out of the competition. First with a slender win at home, and then with a defensively typical performance in the Donbass. This a Shakhtar team of Willian, Fernandinho and Douglas Costa. Fulham had eliminated one of the favourites. Could the draw get any harder? Of course it could. Juve were next, and Fulham could be grateful that the old lady took their foot off their necks with the scoreline at 3-1. The Cottagers would need a minor miracle to progress. That increased even more so when David Trezeguet netted after 2 minutes. Fulham now needed 4. Not only was this one of Fulham's greatest ever performances, it was one of the all-time great displays by a British team in European competition. 14 years earlier, the club could only entice 3,000 fans to come watch their 4th-tier tie with Cambridge. Now they were selling out the ground on the way to a 4-goal comeback against one of the world's greatest in order to reach a European quarter-final. They did so without Danny Murphy, but he'd be back in time for Wolfsburg, the incumbent champions of Germany. In any other normal universe, Fulham would have been morally shot to pieces by Wolfsburg's late away goal, and yet that advantage was wiped out within a minute back in Germany, thanks to who else but Bobby for England, Zamora. Come the Final Four, Fulham were the obvious outliers now. It was a field that contained 6 European Cups, 5 of which were Liverpool's, and the Cottagers were the only team who had yet to play in a European final. Next were HSV, where the final would eventually be played on May the 12th. It was another exquisite away performance that looked all set to be undone when Mladen Petric netted after 22 minutes for the Germans. The Croatian, who had put England out of Euro 2008 qualifying 2.5 years prior, wouldn't have the last laugh in West London, however. Fulham stirring a comeback like England couldn't do via Simon Davies and Zoltan Gera. Now it was back to Hamburg, and thanks to Diego Forlán's extra time winner, he had made the Scousers cry once again, and it would be Atletico Madrid, the opponents. Fulham were 4 minutes away from penalties, which aren't a lottery, but in a 12-yard battle between the experience of Mark Schwarzer and the youth of David De Gea, they had as good a chance as any. Still, Bobby Robson's winning of the 1997 Cup Winners' Cup remains the last time an English manager won a European trophy. And yet, that wasn't the end to the heartbreak in the summer, known as 2010. Nope. Roy Hodgson's contract was up, Liverpool knew it, and they opted to replace their Champions League winning Rafael Benitez with the Fulham man. He'd be out of a job again come Christmas. Meanwhile, at the cottage...
15 seconds left in the 90. Dembele. And he's won it!
Mamba, though. That's dangerous. Hughes just managed to turn it away, but Klasnich just turned it in and...
Mark Hughes, who never really had his heart set on the job, was in, knowing he was third choice at best behind Sven-Göran Eriksson, who rejected them, and Martin Jol, who was thwarted by Ajax. Meanwhile, Hughes had to juggle a raft of contracts running out, from Danny Murphy and Dixon Atuhu to Paul Konchesky, as well as Chris Smalling's £10 million sale to Man United. Moussa Dembele was repurposed into a central midfielder and was the one true good deal made in 2010 at a £5 million snip from AZ Alkmaar. Muhammad Al-Fayed had sold Harrods for £1.5 billion. Was this profit trickling down? Have a guess. The season had started in unbeatable fashion though, as the Cottagers didn't taste a loss until October the 16th. Then again, they'd only won one game, the one we've just shown you against Wolves. Whilst Bobby Zamora had signed a new deal, it took him less than a game after inking the contract to break his leg. Meanwhile, Mark Schwarzer was being denied a move to Arsenal, and to top it all off, a statue of a club legend was unveiled. No, not Johnny Haynes or George Cohen, but Michael Jackson.
I'm Michael Jackson. I welcome you to my crib. Moon, motherfucker.
Sure, they were skirting the relegation zone on Christmas Day, and Mark Hughes faced calls to be axed. On the other end of the festivities, Fulham recovered to finish only a place and 4 points behind their all-time great performance of the 08-09 season, again with a defensive record that only the top 3 could better. With Birmingham City winning the League Cup from 18th place and Stoke occupying 13th but grabbing the other European spot on account of their FA Cup final appearance, Fulham were a long way from European qualification, except that wasn't wholly true. England were due a spot in the Europa League's first qualifying round thanks to the winning of the fair play record. Atop that particular table, Fulham. The boys were back on tour.
Chance, new signing Reza with the cross, Zamora with the step over, and Johnson with quick feet to tuck.
Murphy protiv Vukovića i to je 2-0.
Kelly, down назад, Sidwell виконує подачу.
Amid rumours that Aston Villa were in for him, Mark Hughes blobbed on Fulham, resigning just 11 months in charge. He never would get that Villa job. Thrown into the shit at such short notice and the deadline of Hughes' release clause, which was quick to activate, Fulham went back in for Martin Jol, now a free agent. Thrown into the deep end of competitive football in pre-season, which began at home to NSI Runovic on June 30th and via Northern Irish unit Crusaders RNK Split of Croatia and Dnipro unpronounceable last name, Fulham had earned a shot at the group stages again. This time they went into the final group game of a much weaker group holding all the cards and a home tie against the group whipping boys, Danish side Odense. They were 2-1 up against the Danes with the clock slowly ticking away. Then they took a fall, a Baye Gibi fall. The man who scored a last gasp equaliser that sent Wisla Krakow and not Fulham into the knockout stages. Now it was obvious that the Cottagers were facing diminishing returns. They wouldn't win a game in the league until October, but when they did, they paggered QPR 6-0. Wins would come more regularly, and for a team that never usually could find the net with regularity, they struck 5 or more goals 3 times. Newcastle United the victims in January of a 5-2 pasting, and Wolves were next in line in March. For a squad that had only really brought in John Arnorisa and Costa Rican Brian Ruiz, the improvement to 9th ahead of the more fashionable pretenders in Swansea and Norwich was a massive shock.
Moving inside and outside and bringing in Berbatov!
Rita. Rodriguez in the middle, it's a dangerous cross! Berbatov!
September. Fulham's opener was controversial. It came after 10 minutes.
Out Rita. Berbatov waits in the centre. Here is Berbatov!
Dimitar Berbatov for 2-0 Fulham.
Alas, this was Clint Dempsey in his pomp, and Fulham started the 2012-13 season with more of the same from the prior campaign. Another 5-goal haul, this time against Norwich. He would be joined up front by Dimitar Berbatov, whilst Hugo Rodallega and Mladen Petric would swarm around them. The changes continued to be rung as Fulham sped away from Hamburg and that Europa League finding by adding Kieran Richardson, Georgios Karagounis and Ashkan moves like Djaga. Their final resting place was nowhere in the Cups, and a 12th position that had come to epitomise Fulham these days. They weren't going to break into Europe anytime soon, what with a now top 4 bloating into a big 6, and Everton as well as a rotating band of Pep Guardiola cast-offs, notably Swansea and Southampton. The bubble had already burst long before Martin Jol was carted away. 21 million quid was brought into the club through the sales of key men to Spurs, the duo of Clint Dempsey and Moussa Dembele. They never replaced them. Muhammad Al-Fayed sold up, and therefore Fulham began the 2013-14 season from a standing start.
Hull went on to get 6.
An extraordinary second half. Yeah, absolutely. That was a 6 in the flesh. He enjoyed his day back at Hull. Yeah, Wilson.
They must have planned it for some time.
And then Robert Corrigan. Just
There's a corner of history where Portsmouth were the best team arguably in world football. 2-time champions of England as the 40s became the 50s. Then there's a more familiar version of Pompey, barrelling towards bankruptcy afterwards. Today we cover both. This is the rise and fall of Portsmouth FC. Football came to Frogtown on April 5th, 1898 when a bunch of lads met at number 12 High Street and agreed to buy 5 acres of land just off of Goldsmith Avenue. They'd seen those heathens at nearby Southampton flourish with their participation in the Southern League and fancied a bit of that. Cut to 1902 and they've just won the Southern League for the first time. This hardly a poor division considering Portsmouth had to beat the reigning FA Cup holders Tottenham Hotspur to the title. And yet, Pompey wouldn't get their Football League bow until after the war and the great expansion of 1920. Situated in a hurriedly repurposed 3rd Division South, the club would be the first of the new influx of teams to breach the top flight. Billy Haynes formed the bedrock of the club's promotion from the third tier in 1924 and simply went to another level by the time of the 26-27 campaign. He bagged himself 40 goals as one of the tightest promotion races was settled between Pompey and Manchester City on the final day of the season. Middlesbrough had already gone up as champions well in advance of Portsmouth's welcoming of Preston North End and City's hosting of the already relegated Bradford City. With two teams going up, Pompey and City could only be split by goal average. Portsmouth roared to a 4-1 lead, seemingly assured of their own promotion. Then news was fetched from Main Road. City had thoroughly pumped Bradford 8-0. Kicking off 15 minutes later, Pompey needed just one more goal. Who else but Billy Haynes, 4 for the day, 40th of the season, as Pompey earned promotion to the big time by 0.006 of a single goal. With the arrival of the First Division, Jack Tin was appointed as manager, and the best compliment you could pay him was that Portsmouth became part of the furniture before football was suspended in lieu of war. Those arbitrary positions, though, didn't tell the full story. That's the famous Twin Towers of Wembley Stadium, not just once or twice but thrice, as Pompey ensured it was third time lucky before the sport was postponed for half a decade. Bolton had their number in 1929 thanks largely in part to Tommy Bell's injury, which rendered Pompey effectively down to 10. 5 years later, Manchester City gained ample revenge for the great promotion battle of 1927, Portsmouth again suffering injury when captain Jimmy Allen went down with concussion. But 10 years after their first visit, the Pompey chimes were out again, as not a single goal was conceded across 4 home ties before Highbury was the venue for the Fratton Club's dispatching of Huddersfield in the semi-finals. This time without injury, goals from Bert Barlow, John Anderson, not the ref from the 90s hit TV show Gladiators, and a brace from Cliff Parker finally won the cup. It was to be the last great day for quite some time, not just in Portsmouth's football history, but in any kind of football history. I think I'm safe in saying that no club will ever hold on to the FA Cup for as long as Portsmouth did. They held on to the trophy for 7 long years, but in reality, that defence ended at the first possible opportunity with a defeat against Birmingham City in the January of 1946. Old Jackie Tin had been busy during the war, and the formulation of a scouting network had unearthed prizes as shiny as Dougie Reid at a snip at $7,500 from Stockport County. A return to organised league football in the autumn of 46 had been an unmitigated disaster, as Pompey marked the first footballing Christmas in almost a decade with 2 losses to Arsenal, which left them bottom of the pile on Boxing Day. Thankfully, there wasn't the fear-mongering of being bottom at Christmas just yet, and thankfully Ernie Butler had earned himself the Pompey goalkeeper's jersey, one that he would keep for quite some time. There's that scouting network working overdrive again. 5 wins in 20 matches up to Boxing Day gratefully became 9 from their last 22, earning them the safety of mid-table. Just another season of Portsmouth in the top flight, minimal mid-table fuss. Then the potential wrecking ball flung itself through the Fratton end. Jack Tin had retired. In his place, the lineage of his good work continued through Chief Scout Bowtie Bob Jackson. Bet you can't guess where he got that fucking nickname from. Either way, the club was in rude health, and it was partly due to him, not just the manager. Winning 6 of their first 9 didn't derail matters. A 6-0 thrashing of Sheffield United, the pick of the bunch, whilst a strong Liverpool team were also defeated at Fratton Park in mid-September. The new manager continued to work his magic on the transfer front, acquiring Ike Clark in November amid a poor run of form, whilst Jimmy McAlinden would be a notable departure, more on him in a little bit. Whilst Clark was able to bag a goal on his debut in defeat to Aston Villa, the frontman wouldn't become prolific just yet. Meanwhile, it was the springtime acquisition of Albert Juliusson from Dundee that proved the bigger profit. He swaggered into the Pompey blue, netting a hat-trick in a 6-1 thrashing of Middlesbrough in April, and would amount to a similar amount of goals as Clark, but in far fewer outings. One would go on to be a club legend, the other wouldn't make it beyond the 1947-48 season. Yep, that was Julianson leaving, sent on his way up to Goodison Park by August, disillusioned by the regimented training down on the south coast, whilst Clark stood the test of time. Again, it was another season of relaxation in mid-table. The club won 3 more games, conceded 16 fewer goals, and earned themselves 4 more points, i.e. just another season of Portsmouth FC. Despite the minor improvement, nobody envisioned what was to come. Even history was against Portsmouth, outside of what looked to be an anomalous Arsenal run of 5 titles between 1930 and 38, built off the back of a Yorkshireman in Herbert Chapman nonetheless. No club who could consider themselves Southern had won a championship. Then again, Arsenal were currently reigning for a 6th time. Perhaps this was the era where a Northern-led dominance would be over. After an existential crisis about players striking over wages, the season commenced on August 21st with nothing much out of the ordinary, a 2-2 draw up at Preston. Then came the flood, 4-0 in front of their own fans against Everton, and even better 5-0 back at their place the following week, whilst the likes of Burnley, Stoke, Middlesbrough, Charlton, Sheffield United, Newcastle and Sunderland were all crushed before mid-October. Pompey had yet to taste defeat. They were unlockable defensively, but still commanded just a 2-point lead over Derby County in second. A new challenger for a new decade revealed itself the following week, Stan Cullis's Wolves exacting Pompey's first defeat of the season in a damning 3-0 display. Consolation from the 39 Cup final, perhaps. Portsmouth would record just 2 wins in advance of Christmas Day, but it would be the first one which informed the remainder of the campaign. You see, after a 5-game winless run, Portsmouth were due to celebrate their golden jubilee, and in much simpler times, the club was allowed to commemorate this occasion by selecting a date and an opponent for it. They chose champions Arsenal. They chose November 27th, and goals from Jack Froggatt, Len Phillips, Bert Barlow and Ike Clark sealed it. The line in the sand was drawn. The title charge reignited. The season had changed. This one belonged to Portsmouth now. This year's Christmas doubleheader came against Chelsea, and they were slapped about twice before what would become known as a New Year's aberration took place up at Turf Moor. Then it was time for the resumption of the grandest, oldest football competition in existence, and a reaffirming 7-0 win over Stockport led into the springtime grinding out of results against Stoke, Charlton and Man City in the league, and Sheffield Wednesday in the cup. Double dreams over, Portsmouth still kept a stranglehold on the destination of the Championship. Holding a crucial game in hand and a 3-point advantage over Newcastle United, they just had to avoid a self-destruction to get over the line. 10 matches remained, the first of which required a steady hand after racing into what would turn out to be an insurmountable 3-0 half-time lead against champions of 2 years prior, Liverpool. The second of which a midweek trip up north to title rivals Newcastle. All Portsmouth had to do was keep their heads, and they did, netting 5 times at St James's Park with 5 headers, 2 for Peter Harris, 3 for Jack Froggatt. The pendulum swung to Pompey. A loss at Blackpool partially undid that hard work, but Easter arrived, a notoriously king-making time of the year, with its home triumphs over Birmingham and Wolves, which declared Pompey ready for the Championship. And it could have been won on April the 18th, given Newcastle's shock defeat against Middlesbrough, but Pompey were spineless at St Andrews, foregoing the title for now with a 3-0 loss. The same was required 5 days later, a win on the road plus favours. This time Pompey did their bit. Ike Clark and Peter Harris goals, overturning a Bolton lead at Burnden Park. Nearby, their rivals were both trailing. It didn't matter that Newcastle's Bobby Mitchell got an equaliser at Anfield, or that Johnny Downey had done the same for Man United at Old Trafford against Preston. Portsmouth were officially champions of England. It's always harder to stay at the top of the mountain though, isn't it? And whilst there were blistering performances, just ask Borough, who shipped 5 in front of their own fans, and Everton, who once again suffered early torments against Pompey, the season never truly took off. It was a campaign of catch-up as Manchester United dumped Pompey out of the Cup 5th round, as the Charity Shield was shared with Wolves, and as trips to the Hawthorns, Blumfield Road and Turf Moor would end in defeat towards the back end of 1949. The Pompey players must have sat there after their cup elimination at Old Trafford and pondered what was left to do in the season. One quick glance at the table would have told them this was still a highly competitive league, or one of low quality, scratch out one according to your philosophy. To some extent, Pompey had attempted to buy their way into a settled team as a slew of injuries necessitated signings like Jimmy Stephen from Bradford Park Avenue. Even with cup elimination behind them, Pompey couldn't quite shake the cobwebs of their season. Defeats at Molineux and the baseball ground continuing the champions' inconsistencies. Still, the gap remains 6 points despite Portsmouth's position in 7th with 11 to play. History demanded it be a Man United, Liverpool or an Arsenal. Form demanded it was a Blackpool or a Sunderland or a Wolves. Portsmouth were the outsiders in their own title defence. What's worse, Jimmy Scowler had been sent off against Derby County. Park that one for the time being. We'll come back to it since automatic suspensions were some decades away and the next FA disciplinary hearing wasn't until April. 3 days later, Pompey got their show back on the road thanks to a comeback against Burnley and what had become a handy point on the road against Sunderland. To end March, Dougie Reid forced a hat-trick in against Chelsea. Gap down to 4 points, Portsmouth comforted themselves with a game in hand, a graduation to 5th and the fact that they still had to meet the leaders at Old Trafford. Peter Harris got the winner at Stoke. The points came easier against Fulham on Good Friday, the gap now down to 2 points. The game in hand remained, but still, Portsmouth couldn't say they had things in their own hands just yet, thanks to Sunderland's placing 3rd and a point ahead of them. But we should know by now, Easter is the kingmaker. Nobody is immune, even champions, as West Brom, still in a relegation battle, turned up and stole 2 points. Whilst Liverpool and Man United continued to flounder, Blackpool and Sunderland did not. Therefore, Portsmouth looked to have surrendered their championship. But hold on, Easter wasn't yet over. Cut to Monday, both points desperately won at Fulham to keep Pompey alive. Then the news from around the country piled in, each one more delicious than the last. Blackpool lost at home to Everton, Sunderland lost at Borough, Liverpool lost at Burnley and United sacrificed a point at Birmingham. Therefore, Portsmouth could be said to have exited Easter better than how they entered it. Still with that game in hand over the leaders, still with the visit of Old Trafford to come, but still with matters out of their hands due to Sunderland leading them by a point. And that trip to Old Trafford was next, mind-bogglingly double booked against a Scotland-England international at Hampden. Fortunately for both sides, they lost just one player apiece. Dougie Reid and Jack Froggatt with the goals in the final knock-ins in Manchester, well before Fergie time was even dreamt up. A good day got even better with the news that Sunderland had surrendered their lead against the other club from Manchester. Liverpool, breaking in their special cup final kits, were next at Fratton Park. They still held more than a chance of winning the title, but Portsmouth could end their double dreams as a contest with a win. Again, it was a late show from Pompey, Jack Froggatt, Dougie Reid with the goals, and once again the day was bettered by results from elsewhere, Man United and Sunderland both losing, whilst Blackpool were held at home to Chelsea. It was the perfect time then for a 10-day break, since Portsmouth's next opponents were eventual cup winners Arsenal. Pompey were safe in the knowledge that they would still be at the top come the trip to Highbury. In the meantime, Blackpool joined Man United and Sunderland in derailing their title ambitions. What's that? The FA bulldozing their way through with that belated disciplinary hearing. Yep, Jimmy Scowler was banned for the remaining 2 games. On a day which could have effectively sealed the title, Portsmouth surrendered to the cup holders. It gifted the neutral a tantalising 3-way fight for the championship 3 days later. Wolves needed a goal-scoring miracle at home to Birmingham if Portsmouth were to win at home to Aston Villa. Meanwhile, Sunderland waited in the wings at home to Chelsea should either team lose. They wouldn't, as 3 thrashings, 4-1, 5-1 and 6-1, all went in the favour of the contenders. Portsmouth had done it again, the first champions to be decided by goal average since Herbert Chapman's Huddersfield Town in 1924, the first champions to defend their crown since 1935, again down to Herbert Chapman, this time the Arsenal team that he built. It would be a feat only repeated twice in the next 26 years, the first due to a special team known as the Busby Babes and the second owed partly to their perishing and partly due to Stan Cullis's genius at Molineux. Whilst they would get to sample the European Cup, Portsmouth sadly would never be given that honour. Welcome to the shambles part of the video, and I suppose I did promise more on Jimmy McAlinden. Oh, well, illegal payments to him after the war landed Pompey directors Vernon Stokes and Harry Wayne with suspensions which would ultimately last for almost the entirety of the 1950-51 campaign, which couldn't have gone any worse. Second tier Luton Town dumped Pompey out of the cup at the first available opportunity, and there was to be no powers of recovery in the league this time from Bowtie Bob's team. 13th on Christmas Day and 14 points off the surprising pace of Middlesbrough, they would only be able to close that down to a point from Arthur Rowe's brilliant eventual championship winning Spurs team. The 51-52 season, however, saw a mini resurgence as the club entered March with double aspirations still alive and well. The visit of Newcastle in the quarter-final of the Cup was next, 2 points the difference to league leaders Manchester United. Then just 3 wins from their final 12 matches condemned Portsmouth to what would become the new normal, mid-table mediocrity and no trips to Wembley. That was only confirmed when Bob Jackson upped and left as manager. You'd assume he'd be going to one of the all-time great clubs, wouldn't you? Wrong. Hull City was his next quite literal port of call. Former reserve coach and teacher Eddie Lever was next, a move designed to act as the next in the pipeline. In the end, the club plumbed new depths continually. 15th became 14th before the renaissance nobody saw coming, a half-arsed title bid in 55. Easter had just buggered off and Pompey were still in the mix, proof if it was needed that they were contenders. 6 points back, yes, but they had 2 games in hand and the visit of Chelsea was next. The title was in Portsmouth's hands once again. Not for long, a goalless 90 minutes at Fratton followed 3 more draws, derailing that particular title bid, and it would be the last Portsmouth would ever experience in the top flight at least. As the Championship stars departed, the scouting network was arguably still working. Ray Crawford coming through the ranks and Derek Dugan being acquired. They'd somehow only managed 51 league games before Crawford left to win the league and star in a European Cup with Ipswich, and Dugan left to visit Wembley with teams like Blackburn and Wolves. Meanwhile, the arse fell out of it at Fratton Park. The lever pulled on lever before relegation could be confirmed to Division 2 in 1959. His successor Freddie Cox wouldn't make it to the end of the 60-61 campaign, where Portsmouth fell to yet another relegation. George Smith was able to steady the ship, earning promotion back to the second tier immediately. The 60s, whilst a cultural shift towards the colourful for the rest of the country, remained a monotonous beige for the supporters of Portsmouth. The era of the teenager up and down Britain, as George Smith simply deleted the reserve and youth teams at Fratton Park. A new tact was found in 1967 when they went 3 games with Hull City in the Cup's third round to see just how much money could be squeezed out of attendances before ultimately elimination was found in the next round against Spurs. Fans were still flocking to Fratton to see players like Mike Treblico, as Pompey missed out on promotion in 1968 thanks to a stuttering final furlong. Upon returning to the grey middle ground, Smith somehow got himself a promotion as general manager, leaving the club in the hands of a tracksuit manager in Ron Tyndall. The club almost literally stood still for a decade, only finishing between 15th and 17th, making this graph look silly. Tyndall was given money to strengthen the squad, but the needle just could not be moved, not even by the 50k acquisition of Norman Piper. For now, excitement at Fratton Park was reserved for rare home cup draws against the Giants, Arsenal being an example in 1971. Despite the financial situation worsening with losses deepening from 50 grand to 90 grand, Pompey still was spent up. 50 more K going on Alan Stevenson and Peter Price in 72. Neither men worked, barely cobbling together 100 league appearances for the club. Enter 1973 and enter John Deacon. He entered the board, promising to prop the club up with the cash necessary to return to the top flight, whilst even going so far as to change the club's home colours to predominantly white. Losses crept into 6 figures. Ron Tyndall became John Mortimer, who became Ian St John. Acquisitions like Ken Foggo, Ron Davies and Peter Marinello would come through the door on big money, as every oscillation the club tried had them remaining unmoved.
In for Boyer, but handed well. Now Maguire coming in, and what a good goal from Flicked on for Galvin. Yes!
train. And it's 2-0, Billy Hughes.
That was until they finally circled the drain of relegation back to the third tier in 1976. They tried everything. The restoration of the reserve teams continued, big signings such as George Graham mixed in with the young stars of Steve Foster and Chris Coleman, all wasted on Portsmouth. By November 1976, the club had become reliant on their supporters raising thousands of pounds through sponsoring Fratton Park turf by the square footage. After nearly 3 years of being promised money, Ian St John was finally handed a player courtesy of a transfer fee. Get ready, £5,000 on Paul Gilchrist, a striker who would score 3 league goals in 39 matches. It just about summed it all up. Deacon sacked St John with the club on the verge of an unthinkable relegation to the 4th tier of English football after a 2-0 loss at Mansfield Town, which left them in the drop zone with 3 matches remaining. Jimmy Dickinson, a championship winner and Mr Portsmouth himself, on a record 764 league appearances, was enlisted as the caretaker manager. It was total desperation. But it worked. A draw at Preston and a 3-1 win over York confirmed Pompey's safety by the skin of the teeth. The one shining light in this hurricane of excrement was the free-scoring Dave Kemp, who by March 1978 saw enough writing on the wall to determine he needed to get the hell out of Fratton Park for his own sanity. He left behind a scoring record of 1 in 2 and a club who confirmed their freefall into the 4th division with a 2-0 home defeat to Oxford United on April the 4th, 1978. The year's 1978. Portsmouth had just crash-landed into the basement of English football. From champions of England to the 4th tier in 28 years, this is the first time Pompey nearly died and the first time it prompted a revival of monumental proportions. It couldn't get any worse, could it? Jimmy Dickinson, a man with such Portsmouth renown, was having to get his hands dirty with 4th division football. Such was the depth of his service to the club. The only money the club could spare was £15,000 chucked at Jimmy McIlraith, whilst the rest came in on free transfers. And whilst Pompey were predictably dumped out of the League Cup before the season started and the likes of Bradford and York took both points of them comfortably, you'd be forgiven for thinking this was going to be a long-ass season. From almost the literal bottom of the Football League, Pompey punched upwards as the Fratton faithful continued to show up. The results soon turned. By Boxing Day, they were just a point off the Wimbledon pace. And while Steve Piper's knee injury ended his career, Dickinson only got more assured of the club's place in the transfer market, acquiring Derek Showers, Steve Bryant and Larry Milligan for the business end of the season. Sadly, the campaign petered out with just 5 wins from their final 18 matches, taking them from a promotion spot to the nowhereness of 7th in the days long before the playoff system. Dickinson was a man who, it can be said, gave literally everything to Portsmouth FC. His managerial stint at the club only ended by a heart attack. Frank Burrows was installed as his successor and the club even signed Haaland, that's Stan Haaland, who received a promotion from youth coach to assistant manager. Don Deacon went again in for the major rebuild, flashing his cash as he so liked to do so. In the summer of '79, the Football League inaugurated an arbitration system for out-of-contract players. As such, Portsmouth capitalised. Steve Hazelwood and John McLaughlin, otherwise prohibitive, now cost just 90 grand for the pair. Alan Rodgers a snip at 25k, with Joe Laidlaw, Terry Brisley and Archie Styles even less. The result, football from another planet, relatively speaking, of course, and there's no surviving footage because this is 4th division football in the late 70s, so you gotta trust me. Pompey started off like a house on fire, 3s against Huddersfield, Hartlepool and Torquay, 4s against Bournemouth, Darlington and Bradford, a 5 against York, revenge against them for last season, and even a 6 at home to Scunthorpe. The result was top of the table after 14 games with a healthy enough advantage over 5th place Lincoln. Their promotion rivals in Huddersfield and Bradford were both beaten, and it ushered Burrows back into the market. It's called striking whilst the iron was hot. In came Kenny, Todd, David Gregory and Steve Perrin as draws became the order of 1980, and promotion suddenly appeared less likely. Still, a 4-1 battering of Huddersfield Town to end February kept Pompey just about in the top 4, given that several teams below them had numerous games in hand. When Walsall and Lincoln took Portsmouth's scalp to end March, the club still held on to 3rd, but with no point advantage and still a slew of teams waiting to cash in on their games in hand. Burrows' side had no alternative. They had to resume winning, and they did, winning 4 and drawing 2 of their next 6 in advance of a final day trip to Northampton Town. Those oppositional games in hand, however, had been cashed in on. Pompey went into the final day of the season a point behind the almighty Newport County, and whilst Bradford City was still catchable, fate was out of Portsmouth's hands. Steve Davies and Ian Purdy scored the goals to uphold Portsmouth's end of the bargain in a 2-0 win at the county ground. Portsmouth therefore waited with bated breath. Newport had won 4-2. Thankfully, Bradford City was still catchable, and their loss at Peterborough meant Portsmouth snuck into the 3rd division like a thief in the night. The rebuild was on.
Laidlaw, this is Perrin, Gregory, got a shot!
Pulls the ball back, and Glyn Riley makes no mistake.
The results too inconsistent, the draws in this, the final season, of 2 points for a win, too infrequent as Pompey placed 5th. They did get a lovely trip up to Anfield in the latter stage of the League Cup, however, so that was just the tiniest of morsels. Unfortunately, the subsequent 81-82 season started off poorly, and the mood was set far too soon in what was a middling season of 13th place. Nonetheless, it had been a decent rise under Frank Burrows out of the swamp that was 4th tier football, and still the promise remained of 2nd division potential. The seeds had long been sown though for Burrows' departure, however. As Deacon sacked Stan Harland as coach in February, Bobby Campbell was his successor, acting as Burrows' own Grim Reaper, waiting for the inconsistencies to continue for him to take his place. Naturally they did. Campbell was installed in April and immediately set to work in hiring players for the 1982-83 campaign. Ernie Howe from QPR, the miraculous signing of Burrows' Dave Thomas, whilst Neil Webb was acquired from Reading for $87.5 grand, set by arbitration. Then the clincher, Everton's Alan Byerley for $100k. Now Portsmouth really were at the races.
Him, and here's the next corner, and there's Byerley!
Sadly, it appears the cameras only bothered to venture to Fratton Park for the coronation, as these things tended to be at this time and at this level. Nonetheless, it was a spellbinding demolition of the division, 91 points, an obvious club record, as the early spring signing of Kevin Dillon from Birmingham City further dredged the squad out of a temporary winless streak. Fratton Park hadn't tasted the 2nd division for so long, but now they had a frontman in Byerley who was prolific, a chairman in John Deacon who was equally as prolific with his chequebook and renewed ambition. When the club could easily have been fed to the wolves, John Deacon's money had propped them up in the 70s despite the club's frittering down the division. That money held true into the 80s of Technicolor and First Division dreams. Case in point, the summer of 83, out of contract Coventry striker Mark Hateley. Arbitration set his fee at a measly 220 grand in the grand scheme of things. And whilst Richard Money would be purchased for £50,000, he'd almost instantly be ruled out owing to knee ligament damage.
He's got Wallace and Moran on the other side, and Moran is coming in.
Here the one is Sullivan, the chance for Keegan, the goal for Keegan.
As if by magic, Gates averaged at almost half of what they had been in the 4th tier. That combined with a mid-table finish of 16th, as well as that particular derby lost in predictable fashion to what were now a title challenge in Southampton, it was always going to end in tears for Campbell.
I can't speak! You bottleless git, Campbell! You dickhead! You bottleless git!
Despite taking the club back to Div 2, Campbell was tossed onto the scrap heap like yesterday's beef. In his place, Alan Ball, a man who hadn't managed for 3 years, and when he had, the long and short of his experience was a brief stint at Blackpool and a bizarre player coach role at the Philadelphia Fury. Funny how that World Cup winners medal blinded all. With that medal came gravitas, with that medal came authority and the hard decisions to release players like Steve Hazelwood and to spend a flurry of cash on Billy Gilbert and Mick Kennedy, both for 6 figures, whilst going back into Ayresome Park for Mick Baxter. Unfortunately, Baxter's Pompey career never got out of the blocks as he was diagnosed with Hodgkinson's disease and he would be forced to retire. Ball and Deacon didn't need another excuse, but the wallet was quickly reached for in bringing his replacement through, Noel Blake, 150k. Something out of Ball's control, however, was Mark Hateley scoring for England at the Marinakis and tempting a near £1 million offer out of AC Milan. Naturally, that had to be accepted. Whilst losing the club's brightest talent, there was a firmer footing for which Ball could commence his work. Hateley's replacement was Man United's Scott McGarvey at the princely sum of £85,000.
His reward, Kevin O'Callaghan's corner headed in powerfully by defender Noel Blake.
Portsmouth were on fire, unbeaten until a trip to Wimbledon in mid-October, and they even got a brief taste of the limelight in a 2-legged League Cup affair with Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest. It didn't appear to distract them as they stuffed their faces full of turkey and cranberry sauce on Christmas Day whilst holding a promotion spot. The wheeling and dealing would never truly cease in bringing players like Vince Hilaire and Jerry Francis to the club, so too Ivan Golac and Kevin O'Callaghan, and whilst Alan Bailey would be sold downstream to Brighton, Neil Webb filled his void brilliantly. But the naivety of youth at this level arguably cost them as they slumped to defeat at Crystal Palace, which made the end to April encounter with Manchester City must win. For a seasoned team like City, Portsmouth were just fodder as Paul Simpson's lob ended Pompey's top flight dreams. That failure to gain promotion ultimately cost Portsmouth Neil Webb, who signed for Nottingham Forest for £250,000. In his place came the shrewd acquisition of Mick Channon on a monthly rolling contract. By August, he was deemed to have done enough and joined the rest of the new recruits, which totaled at only Kenny Swain, another experienced head. Pompey were quoted at 6-1 for the title as they bolstered their bank accounts, if anything, with an endless League Cup run which featured 3 games against Spurs and gallingly a quarter-final elimination against Oxford United. Top of the league to enter November, Portsmouth nosedived into the festive period and never truly recovered to their incredible peak at the beginning of the campaign. It took Mickey Quinn's arrival from Oldham Athletic to bring about any form of cutting edge, as he found the club in a false position of second, given that everybody and their mam had a game in hand on Pompey. Ultimately, another Naileyman season. Another point fewer than the prior campaign, but now 3 points off promotion. Whilst the experience of Paul Mariner entered the club ahead of the 86-87 campaign, there remained the looming threat of Mickey Quinn's departure at Her Majesty's pleasure for drink driving offences. Luckily for the club, he would avoid prison. Unluckily for the nearby residents, Quinn would go on to re-offend and be imprisoned for the grand sum of 21 days in early 87. Despite that, he still managed to top score for the club, and probably quite predictably so, since he'd missed about as many games as he would for a calf strain. It proved third time lucky for Pompey. A campaign characterised by an unbeaten start, if a little slowly, thanks to draws against Brighton and Ipswich. Regardless, only 3 teams were able to beat Pompey before New Year, which was marked with a 1-0 home triumph against Reading, which had Ball's men top of the tree by 4 points. There was no elongated cup run to distract Fratton Park now, but as April appeared on the horizon, Pompey's form evaporated. Each of Bradford, Plymouth and West Brom took 3 points, and yet, with the visit of Millwall next, 4 points were still required to seal promotion.
Quinn, Mariner, yes, Mariner in with a chance of giving Portsmouth the lead! Might get in the way, now what can happen here? O'Callaghan scores the goal!
3/4 of those points were gained, and whilst Ian Wright did his level best to pop a pin in Pompey's promotion ambitions, Portsmouth didn't need to lift another finger. Shrewsbury Town's 2-0 win over Oldham confirmed promotion for Alan Ball's side. It had been 28 years since Portsmouth had last played in the top flight. John Deacon was hardly going to stop spending money, was he? First off, Alan Ball, here's a 3-year contract, mate. Don't worry, when things go badly, which they inevitably will, you'll get paid off soon enough. Then there's Terry Conn and Mick Fillery, Ian Stewart, John Kerr, Clive Whitehead, Barry Horn and Malcolm Shotton all coming through the door ahead of the new season. It's simply a shame that the actual season had to be dragged into reality after all.
Clarkin again. Oh, and the goal stayed there. Smith, he scored.
I think they call it a baptism of fire. Aside from the draw in the first ever top flight derby with Southampton, Pompey never truly came close to getting a result, and even then the form book had been thrown out of the window as it does for the derby match. Even a 5-game unbeaten run was sullied by 3 draws, which were more keenly felt on the other side of 81 when you earned 2 points for a win. Wins would come through though, only as a dribble. Luton in October, Norwich in November. Defeats though came more competitive, save for the humblings dished out by Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, but pure mathematics had no desire to reward effort. The facts were simple: Pompey would have to generate more wins to stay in the division. Of course, it's all rosy when Derby Day is won, especially in the midst of what would turn out to be a 7-game unbeaten run, but again we circle back to the problem. Pompey were drawing way too much. Situated in 15th place on Valentine's Day, it was ultimately a false position given that they had played the most in the division and the gap to the newfangled relegation playoff spot was just 6 points. Still, the FA Cup was a comfort blanket for Pompey as a visit of Bradford City proved next. 3 goals stuck beyond the chickens as Portsmouth pencilled themselves in for an afternoon on the AstroTurf with a semi-final spot up for grabs. Behind the scenes, cash flow reared its ugly head again, prompting the sale of Mick Kennedy to Bradford for $250,000 in January. By February, the inland revenue was still knocking at the door, and that particular brown-lettered dread translated onto the pitch. 4 games were lost, slapping Pompey down into the drop zone come April Fool's Day. The murderous relegation crows loomed large over Fratton. Thankfully, they were posted at White Hart Lane on the 2nd of the month. Barry Horn, the hero at the lane, for some brief Easter respite. Yes, the Premier League was coming, but Easter remained still important in the calendar. The result handed Pompey the suddenly coveted playoff spot.
Again to tease him. Oh, well struck. Wilson the scorer.
Now, I did say that respite was brief. Ultimately, Portsmouth wouldn't win another game of old First Division football, gaining 2 points from their last 7 matches. As the club prepared for life in Div 2, the generation of John Deacon prepared its end.
Post knocked away by the keeper, and David White with an absolute hammer blow. Checks, turns inside the defender, fires in, to the Portsmouth penalty area. The shot from Wayne Biggins, just the keeper to beat, goes round the keeper, and Paul Lake slots in.
Late is 1-0. And it comes. It's a goal, I think, flicked on.
For new owner Jim Gregory, a reality check for Portsmouth and their supporters, back down to earth with a FUD. For Alan Ball, once 20th place in the 2nd Division was confirmed down to the job centre. Whilst Deacon had been constantly churning out the cash to get names into the building, Gregory was more about changing that building to update it for the oncoming colourful 90s. Not that he was shy of spending cash. Say hello to Mark Chamberlain, Warren Neal and Graham Hogg in the summer of '88, and also Watford's Martin Cool following midway through the season. Towards the back end of the campaign, there was a debut for a fresh-faced Kit Simons and also John Beresford in from Barnsley, although his Fratton Park career was halted by a broken ankle. Whilst Mickey Quinn and Barry Horn were lost in '89 for a combined 1.5 M's, their replacement was purchased for £450. Enter Guy Whittingham. They called him Corporal Punishment because he came from the army and he would dole out the punishment to the opposition. And while sure he was clear far and away the best thing about Pompey. At the time, they weren't exactly a club dishing out the punishment. John Gregory, no relation to the chairman, was too soon into his managerial career to harness this squad as they finished 12th. Frank Burrows returned as assistant but then got promoted when Gregory was inevitably sacked, and he took the club backwards 5 positions into the 1991 campaign. For all the Mickey Hazards, Gary Stevenses and Colin Clarks, Portsmouth were a club locked into the mire of the second division football, and when it had appeared as though the new Premier League would be their home. Jim Smith, bald eagle himself, flew Portsmouth higher than Burrows had done, but not quite high enough, in 9th. But that could be explained away. Hold on, just let me grab my 92 FA Cup sizzle reel.
Sheer persistence enabled Guy Whittingham to supply the perfect shot from 20 yards on his retool, and the substitute Warren Aspinall headed in with just 3 minutes left. Exeter waiting for it. From 25 yards, Anderson's stunning volley was simply unstunned to take the ball skillfully on his head and score in style.
Will come through to Anderson. Crossed in. The chance for Birds. It's in. 1-0. See down here. There it is. Kernigan equalising.
As ever, despite his long absence, put Pompey level. Anderton the provider. Superb finish from Anderton's clever pass made it 2-2. In the second half, Anderton scored direct from this corner. And the youngster must have impressed all the watching managers and scouts with a fine strike to take Pompey to a memorable victory.
Left-footed, with a good left foot. Here we go. Easy one for... Oh my word!
Neil, oh, that's a good-looking ball. It's Anderton, a real chance for Pompey. Darren Anderton, it's there! Oh, it's gone in, it's been followed in.
The first to go with their captain. That's the way it goes. For Pompey. And he does well. So it's 1-1 now. Longer than he might have wanted. The nails are bitten. There can't be anything left. And there's very little left for Portsmouth. There's nothing left. Nothing at all.
Towards McLaughlin!
Welcome to the 90s. As a nation, we were truly having ourselves. For once, Portsmouth were neither spiralling the drain or lifting a trophy. Then, entering the new millennium, Harry Redknapp pitches up at Fratton Park and changes all of that. These are Pompey's most recent glory days.
Noel Campbell, an FA Cup winner in the past with Arsenal, and now about to lift the trophy.
Wembley had been a mere 6 minutes away, then just penalty kicks away 8 days later, but the result was still the same. Portsmouth nearly won the FA Cup, and they wouldn't get a better chance to end a nearly century-long hoodoo, or so we thought. Stick around until the end, big boy. Anyway, Portsmouth shot off into the Premier League age with a rocket wedged up their arse, but they just traded Martin Cool, John Beresford and Darren Anderton for the aged Paul Walsh. Their big hope up front was Guy Whittingham, who had just top scored for the club but had disappointed, scoring just 11 league goals in the 91-92 campaign. And yet he went on to complete one of the often talked about goal-scoring seasons in Football League history. Yep, just the 47 goals, a Portsmouth scoring record of course, that couldn't even be eclipsed by the goal-hungry days of interwar football or when Pompey actually were good. And still they entered March in only 5th place, in a playoff spot but easily closer to the dropping out of the picture for a Grimsby or a Leicester than they were to unseat a Newcastle or a West Ham in the automatics. Then they went on a run for the ages. "11 wins, 1 draw, from the playoff furniture to top of the league, with fate nestled firmly in their own hands for automatic promotion. 2 games to go. What could go wrong? Well, they could go up to Sunderland and get slapped 4-1, the goal difference swing enough to take West Ham just 5 goals ahead of them ahead of the final day. From then on in, the Hammers weren't for moving despite Pompey's win against Grimsby, and so it was to the playoffs for the first time in club history.
Again, as Joachim goes through!
One there towards McLaughlin. Chip in there by Thompson. And Oldfield. And he's gone in. And Leicester. Joachim alongside him. Still with Thompson. It's a great goal.
Even at the more neutral City Ground first leg, Pompey were unable to get past a Leicester team that would go on to be quite the perennial playoff hopeful. For Portsmouth, however, it was just one taste of what might have been as they sunk back into a deeper 90s depression whilst others graduated into the Premier League and made a name for themselves. Guy Whittingham, of course, quickly hoovered up. Pompey were now having to feed on the scraps of a 33-year-old Lee Chapman as the club returned to the bottom half and 3 successive bottom 8 finishes. Jim Gregory's failing health lent itself to a boardroom revolution. Just nobody thought it would be spearheaded by the outgoing England manager Terry Venables. Entering the gig of director of football with an option to buy the club despite a recent shaky financial history, Venables' stock was no higher than in the summer of '96. He found Terry Fenwick working underneath him as his manager at Fratton Park. Venables' reputation gave him the power to bring in star names such as well fucking nobody really. Instead, he was well positioned to help the club conform to the Taylor report before deciding he could juggle the Australia job on the side. So whilst the almighty HELP was busy not qualifying for France 98 despite being afforded every single opportunity available, especially for a team from the Oceania Confederation, Pompey were handed the Socceroos cast-offs, of which John Aloisi was the only one who truly shone, but much like Dion Burton or Lee Bradbury, he too would quickly find fresher pastures known as the Premier League off the back of enough of a sample size of good performances. Portsmouth would bounce from cash flow crisis to cash flow crisis, a jaunt up to 7th place in '97, just another holiday in the top half between spiralling back down to the pits of 20th and 19th that were usually reserved for them as the millennium crept nearer. Alan Ball was spectacularly and unimaginatively rehired, and unsurprisingly, he didn't move the needle. Tony Pulis, a man on the other end of that infamous Man City 99 playoff final as Gillingham manager, was next, not even given the decency of finishing up the year 2000 before he was axed. Steve Claridge was now the front man as Portsmouth lurched between different states of relegation dogfights. Anything Southampton could do in the Prem, Portsmouth could do in Division 1. 3-1 win at Bradford on the final day of the 97-98 season saved their skin in the most spectacular avoidance from the drop. As Jim Gregory's son tried every which way to get out of the club and sell it on, consortiums left, right and centre faded in and out of view as yet more threat of bankruptcy returned. Inland revenue at the door, it called for one man to save them, Milan Mandaric. His first hire had been Pulis, his second hire was already in the building in Steve Claridge, and his third hire was convicted sex offender Graham Ricks. It was clear that Mandaric's involvement wasn't impacting on-pitch matters positively, even if the club had recovered financially. And whilst names like Linvoy Primus, Nigel Quashie and Peter Crouch all came into Fratton Park, the 2001-2 season was just another of the Portsmouth bottle, dormant bottom half football in the second tier. Enter Harry Redknapp, who had just been hired by Mandaric to become Portsmouth Director of Football. Many were hoping he wouldn't be a sequel to the great tel experiment. Right from the off, big names, no bigger than the former young player of Italia 90 and former Real Madrid star Robert Prozineski. It was clear that Radnep, though, was getting itchy feet as director of football. To use modern vernacular, he wanted to be out there on the grass, as proven when he nearly jumped at the chance to take over an ailing Leicester City. In terms of his signings, goalkeeper Yoshikatsu Kawaguchi at nearly £2 million for a grand total of 12 games and 25 conceded was hardly a great advertisement, was it? With a transfer deadline of April loom, Graham Rix was binned off in favour for Redknapp taking the move downstairs into the dugout. Svetoslav Todorov was already through the door and Redknapp did what he does best, spun the market for a loop. Peter Crouch away to Villa for $5 million. Eddie Howe, the headline act of the three names, in through the door before the end of what was an otherwise disappointing 17th place finish. The summer of 2002 was the perfect maelstrom for Pompey. ITV Digital went under, threatening to take a sizable chunk of the 72 Football League clubs with them, and an experienced manager was installed at Fratton Park alongside an overly ambitious chairman. The signings read like a who's who of cult, the Premiership on ITV. Vincent Perricard, Matty Taylor, Ariane Dezeu and Hayden Fox. Then Shaka Hislop and Paul Merson arrived to give the club some more legitimacy on the pitch, with Tim Sherwood following in February. Jim Smith returned as Redknapp's number 2 to provide the same in the dugout.
Visitors on their way to another away win. But that was as good as it got for Stuart Murdoch's side, as Matthew Taylor's pinpoint cross was met by Todorov to restore Pompey's lead and fizzed home his free kick. An unlikely win looked on the cards.
Pompey, well, they were officially flying, 8 points ahead of third place Sheffield United as the season ticked over into February. They'd had an afternoon mixing it with the big boys, showing themselves to be no mugs for Manchester United in the FA Cup at Old Trafford. Then perhaps the ultimate Barclaysman arrived, Yakubu. Within 4 minutes of his debut, he'd score against Grimsby before bagging 2 of the 6 in his next match.
To take Portsmouth's tally for the day to 5 without reply. Merson doesn't disappoint. Yakubu netted in the 57th to make it 1-0.
Promotion acquired and acquired with plenty of time to spare, as that little goal against Burnley attested to 5 games from the end of the campaign. Pompey were back into the big time after a generation away, but the whole landscape had changed. Whilst Paul Merson wouldn't be retained, you just knew that Harry had a few pearls up his sleeve, and they went by the names of Teddy Sheringham and Patrick Berger, with ample top-level experience between them. Then there was the near £2 million splurged on Dejan Stefanovic, as well as Andy Fay. Of course, Redknapp didn't get all of his targets, as Matty Holland and Paolo Di Canio slipped away, but Alexis Mertens' loan from Chelsea completed the summer business.
Patrick Berger released Yakubu. The Nigerian shot was blocked, and there was Sheringham, stole a show. Yakubu racing through the City backline to open the scoring and silence the blue cap by a stunning second-half show. Big Sam had said his side would show the Blues what Premiership life was all about, but it was Harry's boys doing the talking on the field as Teddy Sheringham...
Yep, that's Pompey with 7 points after a 3-game spell in the Premier League against good teams as well. Serviceable Aston Villa, a Bolton unit under Sam Allardyce who were destined for Europe, and a Man City team who were half decent on their day too. The honeymoon was never bound to last all that long, but it did extend to mid-September's visit of Highbury, and a 5-match unbeaten run completed with a draw at the home of the would-be Invincibles. Pompey would be one of just 2 teams not to be beaten by Arsenal in the league all season. Okay, just forget about that 5-1 pounding they handed to Redknapp and his men in the FA Cup in March, and let's move on.
For a return to winning ways, but if one thing is assured in the top flight, it's miss your chances and you'll pay the price.
But before then, form had sagged so much that Redknapp had cancelled Christmas. Even in and amongst this, there were famous victories against Liverpool and Leeds in front of the Fratton end. The next on his streak was a Patrick Berger-endorsed triumph against Spurs on Boxing Day. It was a result that had Pompey out of the drop zone and above much more established teams like the ones that you're seeing on screen now. A point a game would likely be enough, so with the 20 games that remained, more of the same please.
Suddenly the balance of power had shifted, and with extra time looming, Richard Hughes picked his spot, remarkable late equaliser.
It had taken until the depths of March, but finally Pompey had their first away win in the Premier League. In fact, their 4-3 defeat at White Hart Lane served to double their goal tally on the road, this in a match that was played in February. Still, Lamana Loa had joined Eyal Berkovic in January. The Newcastle loanee would have the abiding memory of the two at Fratton Park when he scored late at home against his parent club, thanks to Newcastle allowing him to play. For a club that would wind up being 4 points away from Champions League football, it arguably proved vital. Up until the derby win in front of their own on March 21st, Portsmouth occupied the drop. The South Coast bragging rights must have stirred something deep inside the Pompey boys, as they would lose just one of their last 10 matches. Inclusive of a win over the reigning champions and another point against those that would receive the only golden trophy in Premier League history, 13th place was probably just about right for a resting place. And naturally, when something proves too good to be true, it usually is. It turned out Harry Redknapp was already on the back nine when Milan Mandaric made it crystal clear that he saw Portsmouth without Jim Smith in it. By November, both Smith and Redknapp were gone.
Quasi, stone crosses. And it's an own goal by Popovic again. It happened to him up at middle.
And I had to fit that little belter in there somewhere, didn't I? Good old Tony Popovic tried to convince FIFA to hand out a Puskas award for own goals. Some say he's still waiting by that phone. Either way, it represented a quarter of Pompey's league wins before the managerial change when the nation collectively whispered, "Who the fuck is that?" when Redknapp's successor was announced. The closest link between Velimir Zajic and Harry Redknapp was that Zajic once replaced Latko Kranjčar as Dynamo Zagreb manager in the 90s, Kranjčar naturally being the other father of Niko Kranjčar, after Redknapp of course. So how did Zajic get on?
Chance maybe for Everton, away by Taylor, not too far. Osman!
Both dismissed, and Morten Gamps Pedersen's goal condemned the Blues.
Again in the middle, took on Stefanovic and tried to play it across, and it's in!
Picking up the club in 12th place and 4 points off the drop, Zajic dropped them off in 16th place and still that same 4 points away from relegation with 7 games to play. You could say he kept them safe, you could more correctly say that he did 4/5 of fuck all with what was a club ready for the safety of mid-table. Harry Redknapp would have had his friends in Portsmouth too had he not told everyone he was having a break from football, promised not to go up to St Mary's before taking on the doomed club. New boss Alan Perrin, formerly of Marseille, had the chance to do something hilarious on the final day of the season. 2 wins from their next 6 had been enough to avoid the drop, and Portsmouth, like most of football, sat back on May the 15th and watched the most miraculous relegation fight transpire, but with a front row seat. If West Brom beat Pompey, it could help Southampton go down. No skin off Pompey noses there.
Horsfield! Kieran Richardson! Bottom of the table at Christmas! The curse is over!
With that stench flushed down the toilet, Pompey could plan for the future, and Perrin had earned the right to be the one to shape that future. Only life's never that simple, is it? By November, Alan Perrin had presided over a smouldering wreckage of a football club. Only goal difference away from the relegation zone, but with enough time to turn it around, he was gone. Laurent Robert, he'd been a walking disaster. Yakubu, he'd been sold to Middlesbrough. And Milan Mandaric, he'd been unable to get his first choice through the door. Sheffield United's Neil Warnock was not leaving Bramall Lane. £225,000 was a sum needed to bring Harry Redknapp back from Southampton. By the end of the year, the club were beneath the dotted line and looking at an uneasy alliance with Alexandre Gaidamak, who promised to prop the club up financially. 2 problems: he was only 30 and his dad was by all means a bit of a wrong'un and wanted for money laundering charges. Nonetheless, Redknapp oversaw a January shake-up, Robert was binned off, Spurs were plundered for Sean Davies, Pedro Mendes and Noe Pamaro in what I'd call a triple swoop if I was a red top tabloid, not to mention Ben Jarney, who completed a brilliant foursome.
Continued his run. Downstairs, didn't get there, and it's been headed in by Yuri Yalasik. And Birmingham City, having twice survived scares, have gone in front in the 5th minute.
We waited and waited and waited and waited and waited a bit longer for that magic switch, but it wasn't being switched on. If anything, Pompey had gotten worse, taking just 1 point from their first 8 matches of 2006. With an 8-point deficit to West Brom of all teams, phrases like great escape were being used. 10 matches remained and Portsmouth simply had to start winning.
Mount won that well. Pedro Mendes. Goal! Mendes. Still Pedro Mendes. Oh!
Sean Davis notched his first league goal for the club by bundling home Brian Preska's cross. Failed to clear Benjani's cross, leaving Gary O'Neill with the opportunity to score.
A week off for a postponement didn't derail Pompey one bit as they returned to action on April the 1st and made fools out of Fulham before adding 5 more points across 3 more matches against Blackburn, Arsenal and Borough, all at home. The great escape was looking probable. Now with 4 matches remaining, they held a 3-point advantage over Birmingham. A win against Wigan 2 weeks later confirmed Pompey's place in the top division for a 4th successive campaign. If I give you names of Glenn Johnson, Sol Campbell, David James, Nwankwo, Kanu, Nico Kranjčar and Loren in the 2000s and asked you what type of team they'd be signing for, you'd categorically mention one with European aspirations. They'd all been coaxed onto the South Coast, and that calibre of player, combined with Harry Redknapp in the dugout, just about made them a team aspiring for the continent.
As Thompson puts his cross into the box, deep here, Portsmouth have another goal.
Stands over this Portsmouth corner. Plenty of options. Primus back post! And Portsmouth lead here.
Beautiful pass for Kanu.
Not even a BBC Panorama investigation into Harry Redknapp's involvement in football corruption could stop the Pompey Chimes as they made their home in the top half. Not even Milan Mandaric's resignation as chairman in the same month halted their progress. Whilst an umpteenth new stadium plan was filed into the best seen before believed category, Portsmouth's form was reality. And entering the final day, Pompey were in 9th but still had an outside chance of qualifying for Europe. A win over Arsenal and drop point for both Bolton and Reading would do it.
Got a deflection, Poon right behind it, built it, and it's in eventually, by to the assistant. Graham Poll goes across to the far side, has a word while with the ball in here, comes off Poon. Kranjčar put it in, he thought he'd scored.
It wasn't anything that Pompey did as to why they were barred from Europe and 7th, but from 3-card brag himself, Graham Poll. It says a lot that Portsmouth could be pissed off with their best finish in 1955. Redknapp was not wasting any time in the summer of 07. Sylvain Distin and Herman Hreiderson strengthening the defence. Papa Bouba Diop, Sully Ali Muntari and John Utaka adding legs in midfield and out wide, whilst David Nugent added strength in depth up front. Such was their progress that The Guardian lumped them on to finish 7th in their season preview. The upcoming 2007-8 campaign, outside of Harry Redknapp's arrest in November, would be known for 2 things on the pitch. First, there was this.
Benjani scampers into the centre. There he is! And he scored! The run by the Zimbabwean Benjani! What a goal! Oh, Rosinia! And Kitson! And Hunt! Boynes and Kitson has knocked it past him. And Kitson! Oh, what a... Anderson's in the centre here! Oh, it's out against James. Oh, brilliant stop! This is Benjani on a hat-trick! Benjani! Straight to Davis again. They're queuing up in the middle. Kranjčar's there! Royal beating to the ball. Harper! It's worth a go. Oh, deflection. Marcus Hanneman. And they're in 7th heaven. Comes to Shorey. Oh, deflected in.
Portsmouth improved in every metric from 1 position to numerous points, but still within a whisker of qualifying for Europe. Redknapp was busy rejecting a job as lofty as Newcastle United to remain at Fratton Park. That's a testament to the job that he was in the middle of. Jermaine Defoe was yet another cog in the Pompey wheel to play with on the back end of the 07-08 season, and now the second thing that Pompey became renowned for in this campaign revealed itself. In what was one of the wildest FA Cup seasons on record, with the most open cup field for a generation, Portsmouth's run to Wembley was one built on a tight-knit defence. From David Nugent's second-half winner at Portman Road and the Plymouth comeback to surviving a penalty kick at Preston to winning the dying embers, it was name on the trophy stuff. And if you didn't believe that old shite before the quarter-final against a treble-chasing Manchester United at Old Trafford, then you certainly did afterwards. A sprinkling of rare refereeing goodwill, even rarer at Old Trafford, combined with Rio Ferdinand being the goalkeeper, facing a Portsmouth penalty. The Pompey chimes would be heard at Wembley for the first time in nearly 70 years. As the only Premier League representative, there was to be no finer chance for Pompey to win the cup. Canu with the winner against West Brom, another Championship team in Cardiff, were next. 90 minutes separated Portsmouth from immortality.
Over to him, and you can just imagine the response it's going to get. Scenes of utter jubilation.
Rangers had just lost one of the most tenured and most successful managers that British football will ever see. The task to replace him was up to Scott Symon. The rest is history. This is the story of Britain's first ever European finalists. For years, the fact to be believed was that Rangers was founded in 1873, but the club's formation can be traced back to a challenge game played in May 1872, drawn 0-0 against a team from Callander. By the time of Scottish League's inauguration in 1890, Rangers had cobbled together a team strong enough to win the league, which they did, kind of. On every metric these days, Dumbarton would have received the title. They had a better goal difference, goal average and head-to-head record, but when a playoff to determine the winner was drawn 2-2, the league went, that's good enough, and handed both Dumbarton and Rangers the title. And after losing 2 Scottish Cup finals in the 1870s, Rangers ensured it was third time lucky in 1894 when goals from Hugh Macready, John Barker and John McPherson sunk Celtic 3-1. They'd claimed 2 more cups before the 19th century was out, but it was only when the 20th century turned up that the first great Rangers team was realised. Thanks to the goals of Robert Hamilton, Rangers won 4 championships on the spin. Whilst that record would be quickly eclipsed by Celtic by the end of that very decade, somehow, and their bitterest rivals had gone undefeated in the 1897-98 campaign, they will never match the 100% record Rangers achieved the following season. And yet, despite picking up 3 championships to begin the 1910s as Europe hurtled towards war, the club was in a worse state than ever by the time a certain Bill Struth was acquired from Clyde to be the club's new manager. Whilst the new man couldn't do much about the club not paying wages on time, he could improve their level of fitness, which was sorely lacking. By 1920, the club had won another 3 titles and all seemed well under the partnership of Struth and manager William Wilton, the club's first permanent guardian. Nearly 21 years into the job, he was only stopped by a yacht trip that went awry. Invited by a Rangers director, the yacht would meet its end crashing into the Caledonian pier. Wilton's body was only recovered 7 weeks after the crash. The fate of the club was then handed to Bill Struth, who, let's be honest, deserves his own video, so I'll put it short. The man was in charge of Rangers for 34 years, bringing his total tenure to 4 decades. He won the lot countless times over, 18 league titles, 10 Scottish Cups. He only won the League Cup twice, but that's only because it was established in 1946. The year after, despite leading the club to a League and League Cup double, the club approached Struff with the prospect of retirement. Aged 71, the prospect of leaving the dugout to become a director didn't appeal to him. A subsequent EGM revealed that Struff was now the largest shareholder, as he had quietly collected shares for 24 years. Therefore, he effectively held all the power. 7 years and only 2 domestic doubles and Scotland's first ever domestic treble, Struff's health and waning fan sentiment finally took its hold. Within 2.5 years, he was dead, and his replacement had already begun to prove that he was up to the task. Like all good football dynasties, its succession plan was hand-picked. Becoming Rangers' third permanent manager in June 1954 was Scott Symon. If he had a time machine, he'd probably be hoping to be more Bob Paisley than David Moyes. Symon's Rangers playing career officially came close to a decade, but was completely decimated by World War II. His management career wouldn't face such bad timing issues, as he led little old East Fife to the top flight and a League Cup title before being hoovered up by Preston in 1953 and taking them to Wembley for the first time in a generation. Whilst he was accepted as the wise choice, Symon's first campaign didn't match the lofty Ibroxian standards, third place and 2 early eliminations from the Cups. There were explanations. For one, Will Woodburn earned himself an extreme lifetime ban for sticking a headbutt on a Stirling Albion player in August. Also, a young litter of players from Bobby Shearer to Alex Scott weren't yet ready to carry the club fully on their backs yet. Rangers went into the 1955-56 campaign as the previous season's only professional British side unbeaten at home. The league didn't even start before that tag was lost. 4-1 defeat at Ibrox against Celtic, it wasn't prohibitive to Rangers' qualification to the League Cup knockouts. Whilst they'd eventually be eliminated by Aberdeen in the semis and win just one of their first 6 in the league, the last of those fixtures away at Queen of the South would be Rangers' last loss of any description until April. Rangers would drop just 1 point again at Hearts before their invincibility streak in the league finally ran out away at East Fife. Although in third place, Aberdeen were Rangers' more realistic title challengers, and they were the next visitors to Ibrox. On an afternoon where the Light Blues could seal the title, the young Alex Scott bagged the only goal of the game. Rangers were champions again. The 56-57 campaign marked another slow start, this time with a group stage loss to Celtic in the League Cup that was terminal to their progress. However, it would be another derby win at Parkhead in mid-September that got Rangers' league season going. Whilst not the rampant beasts of the prior campaign, and no team can be if they go to Starks Park and lose 5-1, Rangers won where it mattered. The league double over Celtic, nice to confirm on New Year's Day, but the more prevalent championship winning double was over Hearts. A pre-Christmas 5-3 Ibrox humdinger became a mid-April all but title confirming 1-0 triumph at Tynecastle. Naturally though, the novelty of perhaps becoming champions of Europe was the talk of Ibrox for much of the early season. Afforded a bye into the last 16, Rangers were paired with French champions Nice and in the same quarter as European champions Real Madrid. In the Ibrox first leg, Rangers battered their French opposition but only had Max Murray and Billy Simpson goals in a 2-1 win to show for it. Even though away goals weren't yet a thing, the requisite draw would be difficult to attain, as proved when Nice matched Rangers' result at the Stade de Ré. There being no penalties, Rangers' European campaign stretched to a third match and a Parisian playoff where they were stung on the stroke of half-time and an early second-half sickener as Nice ran out 3-1 winners. Either way, the winner likely would have been pumped off of Real Madrid, so it was good experience regardless. Over 1,000 club appearances left the club ahead of the 57-58 season as George Young and Bobby Brown departed. And whilst Rangers only regressed 6 points from their previous tally, even at their absolute best they would have struggled to match a quite simply ludicrous Hearts season as they bagged 62 points and a 3-figure goal differential. No, from the off, the season was all about the European Cup once again. After all, they simply had to forget about the League Cup final evisceration they'd received off Celtic in October. By that point, Rangers had already secured their first win in the European Cup after a sizable enough home win to yet more French opposition that wasn't equalled or overturned, as David Wilson's goal in Saint-Etienne was enough to keep the Light Blues in the competition. Unfortunately, given the expansion of the European Cup, this had simply led Rangers to the last 16 and the daunting task of Italian champions Milan, a team that had few equals in Europe. And yet, with 15 minutes to play in front of 85,000 fans, Rangers led them courtesy of a Max Murray strike. Then the arse fell out of it and the Light Blues would be travelling to Milan with a 4-1 deficit to make up. They did not make up that deficit. The final flame of the season was snuffed out at the semi-final stage of the Scottish Cup, despite winning on the road against such luminaries as Cowden Beef, Forfar Athletic and Queen of the South. Ultimately, a pair of controversial Hibs goals sunk Rangers after a semi-final replay. That gloom bled into the start of the following season, where Rafe and Third Lanark had Rangers' number in the League Cup group phase, whilst Hearts twisted the knife in, dispatching them at Tynecastle. As starts to the league campaign go, it was another sticky one, which included another draw against that pesky Third Lanark before Airdronians managed to stick 5 beyond them. Rangers' title challenge, though, was built on the back end of 58, where they remained undefeated. The key match in all of this, a 5-0 thrashing of Hearts on December the 13th. Aside from the psychological advantage it would have handed Rangers, it also helped them leapfrog the Edinburgh club into top spot. They couldn't be split by goal difference or points. That would not change the more the season went on. The reverse fixture at Tynecastle would be the penultimate game of the season, as Rangers remained unbeaten through February and March to take a 6-point lead into the fixture. So long as Hearts didn't thrash Rangers, the title was as good as sealed. A 2-0 defeat? Good enough, and whilst Hearts stuck 4 beyond Aberdeen to take things to the final day, where Rangers might ironically need favours from Celtic, Rangers' 2-1 loss at home to Aberdeen wasn't prohibitive to the Championship. Had Celtic chucked in the towel, Hearts would have claimed the league on goals as opposed to points. It was quite a fortunate escape for the Light Blues. Symon knew the club was missing that edge. They needed something more. By the back end of the 1950s, European football was alive and well, and whilst already detailed Rangers' trials and tribulations in the European Cup, unable to live up to the marker laid down by Hibs in 56, but that decade was about to expire. The 1960s would be a whole lot different for Rangers. The day it all changed was November the 21st, 1959, 3 days after Rangers had broken down the last 16 barrier in the European Cup at the third time of asking. The European Cup would be put to bed till March, but no, the key match in this season was a 3-2 loss at home to Rangers. Well, obviously I'm going to have to explain that because it sounds like the babblings of a moron. Well, a certain 20-year-old wing half for Rafe that day was called Jim Baxter. He ran the game and consequently ran straight into Scott Symon's heart. The deal would finally be concluded the following April. By then, the season was hotting up at Ibrox, admittedly not in the league, as Rangers chucked that one in, winning just 3 league games after New Year, but they had got beyond Celtic after a replay in the Scottish Cup semi-finals, penciling in a place at Hampden against Kilmarnock. And whilst the League Cup was another busted flush at the group phase, Rangers had their eyes on Hampden in another competition, yes, the European Cup. They had gone to Rotterdam in the club's first European Cup quarter-final, they had won 3-2, and after completing their hard work, they only went and fell to a shocking 1-0 defeat on home soil. Thankfully, Sparta Rotterdam were more than giving at the neutral Highbury, where 2 own goals helped seal Rangers' semi-final spot. It was seen as a blessing that they had avoided Barcelona and Real Madrid. Little did they know, Eintracht Frankfurt would be an equally punishing task.
Und 2-1.
Nennen will, aber das bringt so der Beruf mit sich. Da fällt man natürlich auf alles weg. Pfaff.
Und 3-1.
Spitz.
Tor. Lindner. Tor, 5-1. Ja, Pfaff. Ja, und alles umspielt. Oh. Tor.
Not content with getting pumped for 6 at the Waldstadion, Rangers repeated the trick back at Ibrox in front of a relatively sparse, for the time, 68,000. I'm quietly confident I can say this without trawling through reams of Wikipedia pages, but it is the only time a team has conceded 12 goals across a European semi-final tie. So there wasn't 2 trips out to Hampden, and Frankfurt went one better and shipped 7 to Real Madrid. By that point, Rangers had already confirmed their return to the European stage by other means.
Centred the ball, and yes, Davy Wilson had it in Kilmarnock's goal. But the referee had whistled a foul on a Rangers forward. The kick went over the bar. Free kick found Miller. Another goal for Rangers.
The Cup Winners' Cup had been born, and typically a lot of teams were slow on the uptake. For one, not every country had a cup for a team to win to then qualify into a tournament called the Cup Winners' Cup, and if they did, they weren't bound by rules to nominate their actual cup winners. Then you had France and Spain declining to participate, robbing the competition of Monaco and Atletico Madrid. UEFA wouldn't get hold of this tournament until '63, and until then, the kind lads involved in running the Mitropa Cup could barely scratch together 10 teams, Rangers being one of them. Unfortunately to be drawn as one of the 4 teams scheduled for a preliminary round, but Rangers made light work of Ferencváros at Ibrox before holding their own back in Hungary. Borussia Mönchengladbach meant another West German opposition for a team still scarred by that semi-final pumping in the European Cup. This time, however, Rangers went to the Rheinstadion in Dusseldorf and delivered the pumpings, 3 goals away from home without reply before they nearly trebled that effort back home. If you're of a persuasion to call it a Battle of Britain the next match, it's for you. You can trace the first occurrence of this one back to the early springtime of '61. Scott Symon, Stan Cullis, Rangers versus Wolves. In terms of legacy, it was certainly the best Scottish team of the past decade and the best English team of the past 5 years. Had it had today's marketing wrapped around it, people would have been bursting with war. Ultimately, goals from Alex Scott and Ralph Brand gave Rangers the advantage going down to Molineux, where a comparatively paltry 45,000 saw Scott's second of the tie take the game away from the English. Rangers had done it. They had become the first British team to reach a major European final. Awaiting them were Fiorentina, coached by a certain Nandor Hideguti of Pumping England in 1953 fame. Led by the indomitable Swede Kurt Hamrin, it was actually a man called Milan who scored the only 2 goals of the first leg at Ibrox as Fiorentina ran out 2-0 winners. Rangers desperately needed a foothold back in the Comunale in Florence. Instead,
il 27 maggio in uno stadio pieno fino all'inverosimile, il Glasgow viene battuto per 2-1 con reti di Milan e Hamrin.
La vittoria è stata netta della Fiorentina di tutte e 2 le partite.
But of course, it wasn't the whole story to the season. Kilmarnock were dispatched at Hampden for a second time in 1960, this time in the League Cup final, and then there was Jim Baxter combined with a constantly prolific Ralph Brand that proved the backbone of the team. The tone had been set by a 5-1 thrashing of Celtic at Parkhead in September, with the hoops broken back at Ibrox in January. The season ultimately boiled down to just 9 points dropped in the 14 games between Christmas and the April the 1st clash with Kilmarnock at Rugby Park. A win would claim Rangers the league. Instead, the Light Blues chucked in a 2-0 defeat and then got thrashed at Pittodrie 6-1 7 days later as Kilmarnock won at Fir Park to close the gap down to a point. With nerves fraying and still a Wolves semi-final to come, Rangers steadied themselves with a 1-0 win over Hibs. It left the final day and Ayr united with still a potential Kilmarnock overhaul. Instead, Rangers coasted to the crown, eventually sticking 7 beyond their opponents in what was a near treble-winning season. That mood continued into the 1961-62 season, a seemingly comfortable group phase progression out of the League Cup against Third Lanark, Dundee and Airdronians, which bled into the Alex Scott show against Monaco in the European Cup preliminaries and an 8-match unbeaten run to start the league. After defeating East Fife and St Johnstone, the League Cup would not be sealed until December, thanks to Hearts taking Rangers to a replay, by which point a now European savvy Rangers took to Berlin to dispatch of Vorwärts, courtesy of Eric Caldo and Ralph Brand. But the season had already changed dramatically at Ibrox. Rangers welcomed the early pace setters Dundee. They led Rangers by 5 points, only a foggy mirage thanks to Rangers 2 games in hand. A win would hand the initiative back to Symon's side. Then Alan Gilzean netted 4, Dundee roared up the A9 triumphant, and the tone was set, in the league at least, for the remainder of the season. Once Europe was put away until February and Rangers had shaken off more pre-Christmas defeats against Dunfermline and Aberdeen, then dropped just 1 point, tearing through all competition in advance of a now title-deciding clash on March 14th at Dens Park. Whilst Rangers had been thwarted from a potential quadruple by a poor performance in Belgium the prior month, they had just confirmed a Scottish Cup semi-final, and now they had the chance to put 5 points between themselves and Dundee with 7 games to go. Instead, Dundee held out for the point in a goalless affair. To say Rangers rebounded was an understatement. Davy Wilson smashing in 6 of the 7 scored at Falkirk. Dundee United gave their neighbours a crumb of comfort by winning at Ibrox on March 24th, and 2 weeks later it was Celtic's turn to give the Dundonians more hope, earning a point at Parkhead. Still, 2 games remained and Rangers' goal average was vastly superior to Dundee's. They just had to keep winning. Pittodrie and Kilmarnock at home remained. Rangers won just 1 point, ceding the title to Dundee. Whilst they replicated Rangers' semi-final showing in the European Cup, Rangers had a direct impact on the first British team to win a European trophy, bowing out to eventual Cup winners Spurs in the first round. Back home, Rangers though were simply undeniable, sweeping to the league by 9 points from Killie, and whilst they would ultimately stop them in the League Cup semi-final, Rangers did have a trip to Hampden come the end of the campaign.
Henderson centres, this is it. Brand scores. Hughes has the ball. Bobby Murdoch's there. He scores.
The double had been performed. The 1963-64 campaign though would go one better, shaking the understandable 7-goal thrashing in the European Cup against Real Madrid. Rangers coasted to the League Cup by thrashing Morton 5-0 in October. By the time of the Scottish Cup and a trip to Stenhousemuir in January 64, the league was all but sewn up. It didn't matter that Jimmy Miller was signed for the early knock-ins, Jim Forrest simply deputised, and the well-oiled machine continued. Jim Baxter, the newly appointed captain, was at the forefront of everything. For those who aren't well acquainted with him, he's perfectly encapsulated into a Paddy Crerand quote. He was George Best before George Best, and that means the full package, the smooth of his playing ability on the field and the rough of his propensity for a drink and his lack of appetite to train. Regardless, it was a near identically dominant performance, with Killie the silver medalists again. Rangers ran through Partick, Celtic and Dunfermline to meet old sparring partners Dundee at Hampden. The material prize was the Scottish Cup, the glory was the chance to become treble winners again.
Henderson, over it comes, Miller heads it in, to goal! Miller has scored for Rangers. Wait, Walls have been played, used indeed the other end, what a chance here! The young boys runs it in, it's a goal! Kick to Rangers. Henderson at outside left, collects it from Baxter. Henderson inside the box, chips it to the far post. Miller's there, and the ball's on the net! The extra forward, left foot shot, the great save by Slater. Brand must score.
Whilst Rangers weren't quite crowned British champions after a 2-leg defeat over English champions Everton, they continued to break new ground. Ultimately, their subsequent shot at the league was ruined by just 2 wins from their opening 8 as Kilmarnock swept to a belated title. Hibs had Rangers' number in the quarter-final of the Cup, leaving a Jim Forrest double at Hampden in October against Celtic in the League Cup final as Rangers' only domestic salvation.
Them and scored their opener here after 19 minutes. The pass from Baxter was finished off by Forrest.
But there was still Europe on the table, with the strongholds of the continental game in Belgrade and Vienna vanquished. The first after a playoff win at Highbury, the second pristinely with 2 clean sheets. Whilst Rangers avoided former champions Benfica and Real Madrid, they were landed with the only former champion in the draw, the reigning champions Inter Milan, and what's more, they'd just lost their talisman Jim Baxter to a broken leg in Vienna. That was officially what you'd term the end of an era. 1964-65 would be the final season of three Ibroxian stalwarts, Ralph Brand, Jim Baxter and Bobby Shearer. That conclusion was only rubber-stamped by the arrival of Jock Stein at Parkhead across the way. Whilst trophies were traded, Celtic held the League Cup with a Hampden win over the Light Blues and Rangers held the Scottish Cup with a replay win over the Hoops. The true mark to any team will always remain in league competition. Joined at the hip heading into 1966, the tide was turned with a 5-1 defeat at Hampden, and despite being pristine in January, February and in the last 7 games, a winless March bang in the middle was enough of a blot to hand Celtic a championship flag for the first time in 12 years. The 1966-67 season, a famous one for Glaswegian football. In the League Cup, Celtic beat Rangers once again in the final. In the Scottish Cup, however, Simon's side was spectacularly binned off at Berwick Rangers, allowing Celtic their first ever domestic treble, something that had been purely the preserve of only Rangers up until now. Heading into April, everything looked as though it would hinge on a final day Old Firm derby at Parkhead. Then Dunfermline scabbed a 1-0 win at Ibrox, which just about put the nail in the Rangers' coffin. But the season, of course, was not all doom and gloom.
Wonderful goal by Johansson.
Stata na Slavia, to vede doprosto nelepото поражение на нашите футболисти. Тежко е да си вратар на народното спортно поле. Големият факт, че стигнахме до полуфиналите.
Opposition from Northern Ireland and Glentoran had been slain. In the first round, Rangers ended their West German hoodoo with a stunning defensive display in Dortmund after Alex Smith's first leg winner. Then the simple toss of a coin booked Rangers into the semi-final stage as a late Real Zaragoza penalty levelled the tie at the Roman Reda before Slavia Sofia were dispatched after a pair of 1-0 wins in the semis. And so it was to Nuremberg, and near enough home field advantage which was ceded to Bayern Munich. When the team sheets came out, it revealed all was not well. Roger Hinn, nominally a half-back, was selected up front, apparently off the back of netting 4 goals in a reserve game. Alex Willoughby was dropped and therefore asked for a transfer request. Oh yeah, and Celtic had just become European champions 6 days prior. If Rangers needed any more inspiration, they now had it.
Vielleicht winkt doch noch die eine oder die andere Torchance. Tor! Da ist das Tor! Und da hatte Seppmeier Glück. Und da ist das Spiel zu Ende, meine Damen und Herren. Der FC Bayern München.
Looking Keeman, off we go.
Rangers had just reached their second European final, only to lose it again. All the while Jock Stein was building an empire at Parkhead that had just won him the quadruple. This is a story of Ibrox being in the shadows of the late 60s before the great Rangers revival in the latter half of the 70s. Not only had Celtic stolen the ultimate march on Rangers by hiring Jock Stein, they'd won the quadruple, become the first British team to win the European Cup, but Rangers had to endure their worst result ever, a loss against Berwick Rangers in the Cup, the ramifications of which would be felt for quite some time. Personnel-wise, John Greig and Sandy Jardine had become integral cogs in the Rangers machine. Slowly but surely, the 64 treble team were being morphed into one that, hopefully, could compete by the time the 70s swung around. Not even the younger members of the squad were immune, as 22-year-old Jim Forrest, who had been responsible for well over 100 goals, he was scapegoated for the defeat and moved on to Preston ahead of the 67-68 season. It was a campaign that started with a loss, a draw and a win over Celtic as Rangers' greatest rivals eliminated them from the League Cup group phase, while Simon got one over on Jock Stein in the Ibrox League game. Entering November, Rangers had dropped just 2 points in home draws against Hearts and Dunfermline. They had led Hibs by a point, Celtic by 2 and were atop the Scottish game. Not good enough apparently, as Scott Symon was jettisoned in favour of David White, who had 1 year of managerial experience, taking Clyde to 3rd place in the league the prior year and had been poached as Symon's assistant that summer. Whilst Hearts had White's number after a quarter-final replay in the Scottish Cup, Rangers had made the latter stages of European competition, having dispatched Dynamo Dresden and FC Köln in the Fairs Cup. What awaited on the other side of Crimbo was Leeds United. The holders had held Rangers to a goalless draw at Ibrox and quickly dispatched of them in the reverse fixture in Yorkshire. And yet, the season wasn't all over just yet. You see, either side of this Leeds elimination, Rangers had picked up successive home league wins against Dundee United and Raith Rovers, the combination of Alex's Ferguson and Willoughby enough for the goals. Even though it left Rangers with the title initiative, the Light Blues were ruined their harsh suspension placed on new signing Colin Stein. Sent off in a 6-0 win against Clyde, not for the first time that season, Stein was subjected to a season-ending 6-week ban. Rangers were only a point and a place back on the so-called Lisbon Lions with a game in hand. That came next, away at 6th place Morton. A needlessly insane 3-3 draw tied Rangers level on points with their rivals, but they were still behind them on goal average. Now Rangers had to rely on favours. They didn't get one from Morton, who went to Parkhead and lost, as Rangers kept up the pretence with a steely win at Rugby Park. Given that Celtic would end their season the Tuesday after Rangers, they would either be given the benefit of hindsight to know the result required, or have the pressure heaped on, depending on your outlook. Either way, it counted for shit all when Rangers led Aberdeen 2-1 and somehow chucked in a defeat, leaving a miracle from Jesus himself to keep Celtic from winning the league. You'll be surprised to learn that Dunfermline didn't in fact beat Celtic by more than 30 goals to hand the title to Rangers. The subsequent 68-69 campaign started in identical fashion to the last one. Celtic dumped Rangers out of the League Cup groups before Rangers won the 2 points in the Old Firm curtain raiser. Outside of that, though, at least in the league, is where the similarities stopped. Rangers were able to double Celtic, and after twatting Clyde 6-0 on March 15th, they remained in the title hunt, only 2 behind Celtic with 8 to play. After securing a Scottish Cup final with a win against Aberdeen on March 22nd, Rangers proceeded to win just 3 games in all competitions from their remaining 12, as both Dundee clubs and Airdronians had their number, allowing Celtic to coast to the league. Whilst a loss in Bilbao to Athletic Club kept Rangers in the Fairs Cup, they would be eliminated back in similar fashion to another English side, a 0-0 up at Ibrox before failing to score in defeat, back in England this time to Newcastle. The most gut-wrenching defeat though was saved for Hampden.
Better half of Celtic. Conley comes up to get his head near it, and he's done it! He's done just that! Done just that!
The scapegoat this time, Alex Ferguson, who, after not picking up his man from a corner, allowed Celtic to score. It would be the last time he wore the blue of Rangers. The summer of '69 was desperate times, so called for desperate measures, those being Jim Baxter's sensational return. However, it quickly became apparent that he was no longer the same player. He'd last just 1 season before retiring, aged only 31. At the 3rd time of asking in the League Cup groups, David White had gotten one over Celtic, sharing the points with the trading of wins. The problem though was a 3-3 draw at home to Raith Rovers, which blocked Rangers' passage to the next phase. A combination of 3 defeats from their first 8 in the league and not making it beyond Christmas in the Cup Winners' Cup meant that David White's tenure as Rangers manager was over. As the club's 4th permanent manager, he remains the only man to have completed more than a full season and not won the club a trophy. His successor went by the name of Willie Waddell. If anything, league form got worse when it was apparent that Celtic weren't there to be caught, and in the one level playing field he received against the Parkhead club, they were dispatched at the quarter-final stage of the Scottish Cup. The gap was 12 points to Celtic, who showed no signs of slowing as they appeared in a second European final. It is the mark of how bad Rangers had become that their season highlight was Feyenoord's shock win in the final. Another boost was that the Old Firm was finally kept apart in the League Cup groups. Dropping just 1 point and easing beyond Hibs and Cowden Beef only put off the prospect of an Old Firm tie in the competition. Hampden awaited another chance for Rangers to end 4.5 barren years. Leading the line, a 16-year-old by the name of Derek Johnston. Whilst Captain John Greig was missing with illness, the omens did not look great.
Steen and Derek Johnston out in front.
The 1970 League Cup final, a lonely island in a slew of Celtic dominance and Rangers silver in the past 5 years. It wouldn't be the last Derek Johnston goal at Hampden against Celtic that campaign, but sadly the Scottish Cup final would be lost after a replay 4 days later. And whilst 4th place was where Rangers ended up, the entire season ultimately paled into insignificance when 66 people lost their lives on Stairway 13 after a crush late on in the New Year's derby at Ibrox. Out of disaster, Willie Waddell made himself a hero, attending funerals, visiting the injured in hospital and setting it in motion that Ibrox would be renovated so something like this could never happen again. Domestically, the 1971-72 season appeared doomed right from the off. They lost 4 of their first 5 league matches, all but slamming the door on an already unlikely title bid as early as September. Rangers though would finish a position higher and 3 points better off compared to the prior campaign, but now the chasm to Celtic had grown a point to 16. By which point the League Cup had already been surrendered thanks to a pair of defeats against Celtic. The Scottish Cup wouldn't be much kinder after a marathon run ended at the semi-final stage to Hibs, as Rangers had to endure 3 replays in an already bloated season. A season bloated by a good old run in Europe.
Du Stade Rennais. Une faute qui lui est fatale, une reprise fulgurante de l'ailier gauche Johnson.
Mas acabaram por perder à luz dos regulamentos.
Kicked away, stopped on the line, and driven in.
By hook or by crook, Rangers were through to another semi-final in European competition, now aiming for their 3rd Cup Winners' Cup final to be held at the Camp Nou in Barcelona. In scenes much like today's pontificating about how football should be played, Rennes manager Jean Prouff wasn't best pleased with Rangers' direct style in a 1-1 draw in the French first leg, which kicked off the cup run. An Alex McDonald goal back at Ibrox won the tie. They were busy calling it McCatenaccio. Far more controversy was reserved for the last 16 tie with Sporting. After a special enough 3-2 win at Ibrox in the first leg, which ought to have been more, that scoreline was repeated in the first 90 minutes of the return fixture as the home side prompted extra time with a 3-2 lead. When Willie Henderson netted after 100 minutes and Sporting replied, the game went to penalties, this despite the away goals rule still being in effect in extra time. The referee didn't notice, Sporting won the shootout, and it was only the work of journalist John Fairgrieve who brought it to everyone's attention. The following morning, Rangers were confirmed as winners on away goals. The mode of progression beyond Torino in the quarter-final stage, much more traditional, as Willie Johnston grabbed the away goal in Turin and Alex McDonald netted the only goal back at home in the second leg. Deja vu? Not quite. It was the same method used to dispose of Rennes back in round 1. Next was Bayern Munich, and whilst not champions of Europe just yet, they did have a totemic spine featuring Sepp Maier, Franz Beckenbauer, Paul Breitner and Gerd Müller, and plus, Rangers knew all about them after 67.
Oh, mit Würgegriff, was? Und jetzt Breitner. Und Tor! Habe ich gemerkt, dass das Tor leer war. Er hätte ins Tor schlagen können, den Ball. Und dann gibt's Eigentor. Ja, gibt's denn das?
Through to Jordan. Jordan working his midfield triangle, left foot shot, and it's a good one, and it's there! A sensation! Over it comes, punched away one-handed, and a chance for a goal! Referee gives it.
They were no match for Rangers, who once again remained resolute on the road, this time relying on an own goal for their score draw in the away first leg. And this time, after a monumental night at Ibrox in front of 80,000, Sandy Jardine grabbed one, Derek Parr laying his only goal of the campaign with the other to pencil in Rangers for their 3rd ever Cup Winners' Cup final. Next stop, Barcelona, Dynamo Moscow.
Towards Colin Steen. Here's Steen, it's a goal! It's a goal by Steen, what a goal! It's a good ball, it's a goal! It's a goal by Willie Johnston. Steen gives Willie Johnston with a chance. And it's a goal. It's a goal by Johnston. The great chance for the Russians. And it's a goal. And it's a goal. And it is. The final whistle's gone.
field goal flows into the Post-Hodgson.
And just talk about resolve. In front of a largely Scottish crowd, Rangers walked into a 3-goal lead only to be dragged back by the underdogs. But they would hold out and strike it third time lucky. Some note for Willie Waddell to sign off on. Waddell was moved upstairs to become general manager, which allowed Jock Wallace to take the reins. He would be manager at Ibrox for a melting pot of change as heroes in Colin Stein and Willie Johnston departed not long into the season. Stein sold off to Coventry for a measly 140k, whilst Johnston was flogged off to West Brom. Rangers started the season well, comprehensively through in the League Cup. However, they'd suffer 3 losses from their first 5, which kneecapped them instantly in the league. And with the League Cup all for nothing thanks to a semi-final elimination at the hands of Hibs, there wasn't much to play for until the Scottish Cup swung back around. The 1973 Scottish Cup final was more important than most. For one, it was a centenary year for organised Scottish football and 101 years after Rangers had been formed. Jock Wallace's side had been unbeaten in the last 25 games in a strong end to an otherwise whitewashed season for teams in green. Hibs beat Celtic in the League Cup and Celtic, by now naturally, won their 8th championship flag on the spin. It had been 7 long years since Kai Johnson's winner in the 66 final, but that was also against a strong championship winning Celtic side. The club made their belated return to the Cup Winners' Cup after being banned from the competition owing to crowd trouble in the 72 final. They returned to a different playing field. Borussia Mönchengladbach, the team to defeat them after Ajax had made similarly easy work of the Light Blues in the Super Cup the prior season. Against a team as dominant as Stein Celtic, losing 3 of your first 6 in the league spelled disaster, and it meant another regression in the Championship to 3rd behind Hibs. This time there would be no safety net as Celtic eliminated them from the League Cup and Dundee disposed of them in the Scottish Cup. With title 10 on the horizon at Parkhead, something had to change, and quick. When Bill Struth became manager of Rangers, Celtic led the way in terms of Scottish Championships, 15 titles to 10. When the next seismic manager took charge in an old firm capacity, Jock Stein, Rangers had overtaken their rivals, earning 34 to Celtic's 20. Heading into the 1974-75 campaign, that deficit had been significantly reduced thanks to Stein's 9 titles won in a row. To stop Celtic's 30th crown and a landmark 10 in a row, Rangers had to stop their longest ever championship drought immediately. They were doubled by Hibs in the League Cup group phase, signalling the end of Rangers' first dream of silverware. But in the league they started like a house on fire, winning 11 and drawing 2 of the first 13, which included a first win at Parkhead since 1968. This was the trophy that really mattered. Despite losses at Hibs and Airdronians, another old firm win kept Rangers clear of their rivals as February commenced. They led by a point, 12 matches remained. Rangers continued to scrape results, 2-0 at home to Dunfermline and 2-1 at Clyde and at home to Hearts, whilst a Derek Parlane hat-trick at home to Killie didn't confirm both points in a 3-3 draw. Meanwhile at Parkhead, their quest for 10 had caved in, 2 points from 3 games, which was followed by an even more disastrous March, losses at Aberdeen and Airdrie, with a defeat at home to Dundee United wedged in between. As Jock Wallace's side kept scraping wins at home to St Johnstone and Motherwell, as well as at Dens Park, Rangers were on the precipice of the title. Celtic weren't even second anymore when the Light Blues travelled to Easter Road, the team in second place. A point would be enough for the title.
Sprinting downfield, and it's a nice cross. There's a great chance for him, and the ball's in the net, and it's a goal. There's Jim McArthur. Here's Jordan. Keane going on the outside, going in the front. Chance for Stein, and a goal!
11 years of hurt was over, as was 9 years of Celtic tyranny. There remained John Gray, Colin Jackson and Willie Matheson in blue, the only ones who had tasted championship glory up until now. The club was on a high, taking on a world tour of places like Canada, New Zealand and Australia, and the good vibe bled well into the subsequent campaign with the League Cup won over Celtic in October. A 4-match winless run in the league which had transformed overnight to the Premier League, combined with a European Cup exit to Saint Etienne, was the first true test of the season. However, the 1-0 loss at Pittodrie on December the 6th was Rangers' last defeat of the season, in all competitions. When Celtic stumbled in mid-April, Rangers simply kept going, wrapping up another championship at Tannadice 2 days before the final Old Firm derby of the season. Celtic wouldn't even be able to stop Rangers going for the domestic treble, since they'd already exited the Cup. Instead, Jock Wallace's men met Hearts at Hampden.
Johnson moving in, and it's a goal! Putting it in. McDonald. And it's in! Nice play by McKean. There's the cross, there's the goal.
The third treble was complete once again, surpassing Celtic. It would be the last time for a bit that Rangers would have something to shout about, considering the absolute shit show that was the 76-77 campaign. A League Cup season that ran 11 matches does sound like fun, but it required 6 league games and 4 attempts to defeat Clydebank in the quarter-finals. So by the time Aberdeen stuck 5 beyond them in the semis, plenty just didn't care anymore. After all, FC Zurich had eliminated them from the first round of the European Cup, and a failure to beat Celtic in the first 3 of 4 Old Firm league meetings had put the league to bed by January. The good old Scottish Cup though soon came back around again, and a mix of home ties and comfortable opponents eased Rangers into Hampden. The final opponents being who they were, it was never going to be easy.
What a nerve-wracking moment for Kennedy.
And there we had it, a blue treble exchange for a green double in Glasgow. With the rise of both Aberdeen and Dundee United, it made the 77-78 campaign completely unpredictable. Wallace made a bit of a splash in the market, Bobby Russell, Gordon Smith and Davy Cooper all coming in. That combined with the abolition of the League Cup group phase, it was an easing in process to the season. Thank fuck, because both Aberdeen and Hibs beat Rangers in the first 2 league games of the campaign. Thankfully, a 3-2 win in the first Ibrox derby of the season counteracted those upsets, as did progress through to the quarterfinals of the League Cup, where Rangers beat Dunfermline comfortably. The only brick to fall, typically, was yet another early exit from European matters. Young boys beaten in the qualifiers, but FC Twente stopped Rangers from scoring in 2 games to eliminate them in the first round. Before the Light Blues turned up to Pittodrie and received a Christmas Eve pumping on the East Coast, Rangers led the table by a commanding 5 points. In spite of a January 78 win over Celtic, the true test of Rangers' title credentials was in Aberdeen come the spring. When the Dons dished out another win over Rangers, a 2-horse title race became that bit closer, now just 4 points. By the time the club re-emerged in the league to defeat Partick Thistle, yet another trophy had been added to the cabinet. Gordon Smith with the winner in the League Cup final against Celtic. 1 down, 2 to go. Inroads were being made into the other cup too, defeating Berwick Rangers of all teams, Stirling Albion and Kilmarnock to pencil in a Dundee United semi. Since Celtic had already been put out, Rangers were now favourites for a second treble in 3 seasons. It was only ever going to be Celtic to spur on the charge to stop that feat, winning as they did on March 25th at Parkhead. Hibs, St Mirren and Ayr United all followed suit in taking points off Jock Wallace's side to stretch a record which now read 2 wins from 7. The best friends of the Ibrox club in April 1978, Dundee United, who rolled over not just once or twice but 3 times, failing to score in all 3 games as Rangers booked another Hampden final and put them on the verge of another league title. 1 match remained, Motherwell at home, whilst Aberdeen travelled to 5th place Hibs. A simple bettering of their rivals' result would do. Colin Jackson and Gordon Smith with the strikes in a 2-0 win that confirmed leg 2 of 3 of a substantial treble. Next up, Aberdeen and the chance at another streak of immortality.